Nuclear war is the only event other than an asteroid strike that could end civilization. If you believe your enemy is vicious and wants to kill you, you're going to create programs that mirror theirs. This is so dangerous.
Whoa.
These are the mysteries of some of the dark and dirty secrets.
Whether it's censoring social media, whether it's spying on our own population, we are effectively trying to, we, the government, are trying to influence what ideas people focus on. That, to me, that is a self-evident based assumption that my worldview is predicated on. So, for instance, if you're like, that doesn't make any sense, that would be a very good place to start disabusing me of my delusions.
This idea that nuclear arsenals exist on ready-for-launch status and no one thinks about it has always been intriguing. During the previous administration, when former President Trump was threatening nuclear war, in essence, with the leader of North Korea, I was shocked because that was so unpresidential, meaning every president, before him was like, there was a tacit understanding. I mean, listen to Kennedy's speeches talking about the horrors of nuclear war. So to hear President Trump talking about this as if it with a sort of Cavalier attitude was shocking to me, as it was to a lot of people. And then I began to think about this idea that many of my sources had said to me in the course of reporting the previous 6 books, whether it was Bilyeu or Dr. Bud Whelan. Annie, I dedicated my life to preventing nuclear World War III. And then I began thinking, what if that prevention fails? What if deterrence fails? What does that look like? And then it just became a thought experiment of asking people in the national security apparatus, people that I've spent years developing as sources, as people who would talk to me, their friends, their colleagues, national security advisors, military, people who would be in the position of nuclear command and control were nuclear war to happen. And during COVID, when there was a lot more time, people agreed to do Zooms with me. So you can see now that my makeup, perhaps, the ride the horse in the direction it's going is probably a little more active than mental. It's like, oh, there's a horse, let's hop on it and go for a ride. I am a very good horse rider, right? So that's what it is. Like, wait a minute, this is super interesting in a terrifying way. And I began to put this question about what would happen if deterrence failed. And then suddenly I realized this becomes a ticking clock scenario. This is not policy and leading up. This is like, oh my God, starting with the basic fact, again, sharing with you that I learned things. With all my knowledge of nuclear weapons and having interviewed nuclear weapons designers in my previous books, I didn't know literally or hadn't really digested that a nuclear war essentially begins in the first fraction of a second that our satellite system, the Defense Department's powerful satellite system called SBIRS, Space-Based Infrared System of Satellites. Everything's an acronym. That system detects nuclear launch because we have those systems parked over all of our nuclear adversaries, ready to see it, because that's where it begins. Fact number 1, stunning. I'm riding this horse forward. Fact number 2 that's stunning. An ICBM once launched cannot be recalled and cannot be directed. How many people know that? How many people know that? And so while maybe printing money and inflation and all that is interesting to you, what's interesting to me is when I suddenly learned that. Wait a minute. How many ICBMs do we have? Oh, the United States has 400 on ready for launch status. And how many does Russia have? An equal number. And what are the total numbers of the arsenals? US, 1,770. Russia, 1,660. Those are just on ready for launch status. Ready to go in seconds or minutes. Now you really have my attention. Now I want to tell that story. Now we're at second 10 of the scenario that I describe in nuclear war that lasts only 72 minutes. Because another shocking fact, when I did an interview with former Stratcom commander, who's heard of Stratcom? Most people not. Former Stratcom commander in charge of the nukes. General Keeler said to me, in us discussing what could happen if Russia and America had a nuclear exchange, yes, the world could end in the next couple of hours. That's a horse I can't get off. I have to ride that to the end. And how it ends? Nuclear winter.
What makes you think that we are more at risk for nuclear annihilation now than any other time in history?
Well, having written the book, I am now at the conclusion that we are at risk because I'm echoing the concerns of people like President Biden, like UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, like the Nobel laureates I just met in Brussels 2 weeks ago at the Nuke Expo, the Nobel laureate Peace Prize winners who have been studying this issue for decades, interviewing people, having written the book and realizing where we are and seeing people's reactions to it. People saying to me, I read your book in one night. I canceled everything. I couldn't stop, even though I know nuclear war ends in nuclear winter, because we are at this precipice. So I've learned that since the book has become public. Before, when the book began, when I was reporting back years ago, during COVID, it was like many of the Cold War warriors, because many of the people I interview for the book, are in their 80s and 90s, including the man who drew the plans for that thermonuclear weapon on the cover of that book, Richard Garwin, 93 years old now. Just emailed with him yesterday. Après moi le déluge, he told me. That's what he's afraid of, a nuclear madman, a mad king with a nuclear arsenal. But when I began reporting the book, people, the Cold War warriors, were like, Annie, you must write this book. No one, people have forgotten this is so dangerous as a threat to all of our existence. And here we are, just a couple years later, where nuclear war, the threats of nuclear war, is headline news. That I can't answer.
Now, I had heard you say in another podcast that you thought this was the most, we'd never been closer to the brink than we are right now. Compared to Bay of Pigs or something like that, do you think that we really are that much closer, or is it just that the bombs are that much bigger? What makes you write this book right now? Is it just that horse came up at this particular moment?
Absolutely, because it's a scenario. But in terms of the danger of it, again, those things have been said to me. President Biden is the one who said we're closer to nuclear Armageddon than we have been since the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we're really close. And so, but the interesting thing is that the degree of danger doesn't really matter. That's what is so shocking, and I really hope people read the book in one night or 2 nights, because the takeaway is, oh my God, it doesn't matter how it happens. She just showed one way it could happen. But what she also showed is the system in place. Once it begins, it doesn't stop. It is a system of systems, nuclear command and control. It begins with the detection of a launch, and it ends in nuclear winter. And that is how the system has been set up. So what is the most shocking to me about all of this is that most people have no idea. And in the same way, that's not a self-righteous statement. I certainly had no idea before I reported the book.
Okay, you said it in French a minute ago, but the quote, I believe, is from Napoleon, after me, the flood. So this idea of a nihilistic madman, I think in the book, you expressly, obviously it's a fictional account, but based entirely on things that we know. What's the concept that North Korea basically decides we're just going to burn it all down? Walk us through how it could pop off.
And one tiny distinction I would make is I don't refer to this as a fictional scenario. I call it a hypothetical scenario, because every detail in here is linked to a concept, a military concept of how nuclear war would unfold. I very specifically stay away from a big buildup of how the war might happen, which many people have written about. You know, if China does this or Russia does this or then this could happen. That is not what I do. The book happens in 3 acts. Thank you, Shakespeare. It's like the first 24 minutes, the next 24 minutes, and the last 24 minutes. And then it's over. There's really it's 5 parts because there's a build-up, how we got here. Tells readers how we went from Hiroshima and Nagasaki to having this massive arsenal that could then launch. And then the end is Nuclear Winter, which I report based on extensive interviews with one of the original authors of the nuclear winter theory in 1983 and others. And so the question you asked is why the après moi le déluge, which means after me the flood, which is this idea, I don't really care what happens after the world ends. And that idea, to use that in the scenario, came from Richard Garwin, 93-year-old Richard Garwin, nuclear weapons engineer. People think of Edward Teller as the man who is the father of the thermonuclear bomb. Oppenheimer is the father of the atomic bomb. Teller was the father of the thermonuclear bomb. A thermonuclear bomb is so much more powerful than an atomic bomb. It uses an atomic bomb as its triggering device. That is a 10.4 megaton explosion in the Marshall Islands when we were testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. And what Garwin said to me when I asked him what he was most afraid of, he said, a mad king with a nuclear arsenal. And I took that to mean North Korea. As I write in the book, there are no rules to nuclear war, meaning anything goes. But there are a few rules to deterrence, to preventing nuclear war. And one of those rules is, very specifically, which I think listeners can relate to, is that, and again, I did not know this per se, and most people do not know this, that we test our ICBMs. Obviously, there's not a nuclear warhead in it, but there's a dummy warhead, and we test them. So does Russia. So do many nuclear-armed nations. And we always announce a test before it happens because you have other countries looking at them and you don't want to start a nuclear war by accident. North Korea does not announce its tests. And when I learned that, I was shocked because in this one period when I was reporting the book, over 18 months, they launched over 100 missiles, including ballistic missiles that could hit the United States. And so when you think about, go back to that idea that I just shared with you about the satellite system in space, watching for a nuclear launch. When the nuclear command and control in the United States sees North Korea launch a ballistic missile, A, it has no idea if there's a nuclear weapon in the nose cone, and B, it has no idea where it's going for the first 150 seconds. And so when I describe to you the first 150 seconds in the book, you get and you realize how crazy everybody feels, how much anxiety. You realize that happens to everybody in nuclear command and control that's watching every time North Korea launches a test. That's madness. That's why we're one misunderstanding away from nuclear Armageddon, because North Korea's nuclear arsenal is relatively new.
Why do you have the premise in the book that if basically one nuke is launched, that it is not a winnable war, it just goes all the way to effectively destruction of all life on Earth?
Mm-hmm. Nuclear war games are arguably the most jealously guarded secrets in the national security apparatus. You could also say what's in the president's football is up there, because that has to do with nuclear war plans. So, last reference to the UFOs, when I hear people, this is incredibly classified. Don't buy it for a second. Nuclear war plans are incredibly classified. So much so that we have no idea what is in them. I write about 2 nuclear war plans in the book. One released by 2 men in their 80s, one of which was Daniel Ellsberg, the other which was John Rubel. That's the original nuclear war plan for general nuclear warfare. And the other was a war plan called Proud Prophet that was declassified by President Reagan in 1983. And from those 2 nuclear war plans, we can learn a lot. And the Proud Prophet in particular is super interesting. I reprint a page in the book, and readers will see that, and they'll just see like blacked out pages and maybe a number or a word, aftermath. Well, and you might say to yourself, what good is this? It's just a bunch of blacked out, redacted information. We can't learn anything from it. Well, what we can learn is from a civilian who was invited to participate in that war game, who's a Yale professor named Paul Bracken. And because the Proud Prophet nuclear war game was declassified, Bracken could speak about it in a general manner. And here I'm getting to answer your question finally, which is that what Bracken tells us is that no matter how nuclear war begins, this is from a 2-week nuclear war game with the Secretary of Defense and all the highest nuclear command and control people, going through multiple scenarios. No matter how it begins, if NATO's involved, if NATO isn't involved, if China's involved, no matter how it begins, it ends in total Armageddon. And that's why the scenario that I write follows that architecture, because that is the closest we can get to the truth about what's in those war games.
Okay, without knowing that, the thing that I took away in the book is basically confusion. It's just, it's moving so fast. Everything is unknown. So for readers, or for people that haven't read the book, it goes something like this. North Korea launches the initial strike. The U.S. is tracking it, so they see right away that it's launched. They don't know exactly where it's going, but it ends up detonating in Washington, D.C. I think it hits the Pentagon, if I remember right. The president is too close to it, ends up crashing, getting injured, so nobody can get a hold of him. So Russia's like, hey, we see nukes are being launched here. Has the president called? No, he hasn't called. Okay, who from the White House has called? And goes down a list of a ton of people. But he's like, none of them are the acting president. So we just have to assume that these are coming towards us, so launch back. And so it's like confusion begets, because everybody has these like dead hand launches or launch at first warning. And so because everybody's policy is so aggressive that, like you said, one misunderstanding and boom, it's just all over. And the book paints, as you said, a hypothetical that is distressingly convincing and extremely detailed in terms of at what distance your flesh melts off and the winds are 200 miles an hour. Yeah, it's pretty intense. Can you imagine a scenario where we can actually back off of this brink?
You mean a scenario where nuclear war doesn't happen?
Yeah, this seems inevitable to me that we would invent them. One, is this inevitable that we invent them?
So I most definitely wrote the book to demonstrate in appalling detail how horrific nuclear war would be. My takeaway, because I am an optimist, is not therefore it's inevitable and it's going to happen, although I'm perfectly comfortable with other people that are maybe more pessimistic having that view and then wondering to themselves, therefore, what could we do about it, right? But my takeaway is the total opposite of that. My takeaway is that information is king and that situations change when people become aware of the danger and the threat.
The US dollar's value is being rapidly eroded, and if you want to have at least some of your investable dollars in assets that can't be inflated, you should look at gold. Gold has proven to be a good long-term store of value since literally the Roman times, which is why, even though I have the vast majority of my holdings in crypto, I have a percentage of my portfolio in gold. And if you're interested in learning more about gold, I recommend you contact American Hartford Gold. If you tell them I sent you, you can get up to $15,000 of free silver on your first qualifying order. Click the link in the description or call 866-934-4005 or text IMPACT to 65532. Again, that's 866-934-4005 or just text IMPACT to 65532 or click the link in the description. Please remember, there is always risk involved in investing and there is absolutely no guarantee of any kind.
Nuclear war is the only event other than an asteroid strike that could end civilization. Technically, there's nothing we can do about an asteroid strike. There's so much that can be done about nuclear war. And the example I will give you is called the Reagan reversal. And what's interesting is I did an interview yesterday with Newt Gingrich. Okay? Newt was friends with Reagan, and we had a really interesting discussion about this. And digressing here for a second is what I love about the book, that having written this book, is that it's being read by so many different kinds of people who are embracing it. And that's where there is, Josh Klinghoffer, the former drummer of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, now Pearl Jam, is giving the book to all of his bandmates. So balance out that. And you're talking about a wide group of very different kinds of people, of all different political parties, of all different ages, reading this book and pretty much coming to the same conclusion, which is, this is madness, we must reverse course. Newt Gingrich told me he wished that my next book would be called Nuclear War, a Solution. And that's coming from a fundamental, lifelong hawk. So change is possible. So back to the Reagan reversal. President Reagan was an absolute nuclear supremacist. He believed in nuclear weapons. He thought we should have more, carry a big stick, use it type thing. He believed that nuclear weapons, the concept of deterrence, would keep us safe. He was the man behind the idea of putting nuclear weapons in space in the Star Wars program. Yeah, okay? So this was his position. And then there was a fictional television series on ABC called The Day After, a movie on ABC. And Reagan's advisors, which Gingrich confirmed, told him not to watch the movie. But he did. 100 million Americans watched that movie. Wow. And they were all horrified and freaked out. Reagan watched that movie and became so disturbed that he wrote in his White House journal that he was greatly depressed. His words. And because he's the President of the United States, he could and did take action. He reached out to Gorbachev, and the result was the Reykjavik summit. And as a result, the big result was that the world went from 70,000 nuclear warheads to the approximate 12,500 that we have today. So that sure is progress. So why isn't the Congress doing anything about it? People aren't paying attention. Why isn't the president doing anything? People aren't paying attention. If people pay attention and say, this is madness, we must reverse course, we can go in that direction toward reduction. Just a general, there are people, legions of people in the disarmament movement who've been working on this issue. I'm not one of them. They know. So yes, that is the right direction. Now, here where I'm going to loop it back to your original question, because this is a conversation we're having. Is the government, whoever that may be, trying to distract us? You could argue, maybe someone or some group of people doesn't want the reduction of nuclear weapons. Maybe some group of people prefers this idea, which is on the table right now in 2024. We need to upgrade our nuclear arsenal, which is what's happening right now to the tune of $1 trillion. We might even need new weapon systems. So that I meet you at a disturbing possibly yes, when I would ask you, could a group of people have a powerful group of people have a vested interest in us not reducing nuclear weapons? And I think almost certainly the answer is yes. Where it gets difficult is you really have to drill down on that thinking. Do you want to just blame, air quotes, the military-industrial complex, the nuclear weapons industrial complex? Do you want to just blame them, whoever? Well, that's a fool's errand, I think, because where does it get you? Or do you want to try to look at the specifics? I believe the specifics are better, and that's where I would put my hat in the ring with the disarmament folks, knowing what I know now about nuclear war and knowing how dangerous we are, and having had, everyone since the book in very high places reach out to me and say, you're absolutely right, something must be done. I would put my hat in the disarmament folks' ring, not in the nuclear weapons industry, military-industrial complex industry that says, deterrence is a really good thing. And for people who might want to just know the simple definition of deterrence, the idea of deterrence is the more nuclear weapons you have, the safer you are. To me, that sounds a little Orwellian.
Okay. Russia, Ukraine. I have a feeling you don't love talking specifically about that, but do you, given Putin's saber rattling, what do you think about this moment as the moment for a solution where we're actually de-escalating? Is it even plausible that he would entertain anything along those lines given the current situation?
I mean, what I have to say about that situation is absolutely on the point of nuclear weapons, is that President Putin has said on the record that he is not bluffing his words about using weapons of mass destruction. That is former American president also was using nuclear rhetoric. So we can't just say, how dare he use that rhetoric. And I think that's a tragedy. I think POTUS, the President of the United States, has a responsibility to act presidentially. And I would hope that there would be a movement back toward that. And I would hope that there would be a movement among the people to have a young, fit, cognitive, open-minded, civic-minded president. As far as Ukraine and Russia is concerned, the situation is what it is, which is profoundly dangerous. And for as long as these nuclear threats remain on the table, the world is at the razor's edge. And so the solution to that, I'm not a diplomat, but is exactly like you're saying. You want to reduce tension, not escalate it. It's too dangerous.
Yeah, unfortunately, I wasn't saying that. I am very much the genie is out of the bottle. There is no going back. You mentioned in an interview that I heard that synthetic biology is also this terrifying thing that we have on the horizon. While I don't live in perpetual fear of nuclear war like I used to when I was a kid, because I actually grew up in the 80s and was literally terrified, I don't see how anything other than mutually assured destruction stops this from happening, which is why I think the most plausible scenario for what you pointed out in the book is you need a nihilistic madman who just doesn't care. In fact, you say something in the book that we posted that photo of South Korea and North Korea at night, and that if that were just something that pissed him off enough that he wanted to launch a nuke to show us just how dark the world could get, that's the kind of thing. This may be naivete. I can't fathom even a sort of crazy dictator would do that, because if they have nuclear weapons, they have to understand that they're going to get obliterated. So it doesn't make sense. So while I wish they could be uninvented, I think if you can't uninvent them, then you have to figure out what is the reality of humans and build your arsenal accordingly. Do you know John Mearsheimer?
Name's ringing a bell.
So he comes from the quote unquote realist political philosophy, which is that the world is simply governed by power. And it's not that people only exercise power, but that if there is a vacuum and there is a weak country and there is no one there to defend them, then somebody who's more powerful will come and take over if they have anything of value for them to take. And so ultimately, the sort of stability that we get in the world is not stability gained through weakness, it is stability gained through mutual strength. And if you fail to understand that people will make a move on you if you are weak, then you will get surprised by, if you're Poland, by, hey, this guy with the lightning strikes, they've suddenly rolled into town, or Russia invading Ukraine. So many people have said if Ukraine had never given up their nuclear weapons, then Russia never would have invaded. Now, whether or not that's true, I'm not deep enough in that issue to say, but it certainly speaks to this idea that I can't fathom a world where humans with our current biology would ever back off to nuclear zero, because they know it only takes one madman. And then if that guy really is the only one with nukes and he's like, yo, everybody else got rid of theirs, ha ha ha, now I'm going to launch mine because people can't retaliate. Now you have a problem.
The Ukraine thing, I have to speak to that just because I interviewed a number of people who were involved in the dismantling of the nuclear program in Ukraine when the wall went down. And what's interesting to note is that Ukraine never really, they had nuclear weapons physically, but they could never have used them. They never were in control of the launch mechanisms, of the triggering mechanisms. Russia always had that. So they would have just had an arsenal that they couldn't have used except for to make dirty bombs. So I think that's a little bit, and I'm also fascinated with your idea that you, even with all the thinking that you do, that you, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you're saying you kind of come back to this idea that deterrence is the best answer because man is inherently aggressive. Is that fair that maybe you're saying that?
I probably wouldn't have used the word aggressive, but let us not split hairs.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So two things come to mind. Have you seen Chimp Empire, the Netflix?
I haven't, but I've heard you talk about chimps on a treadmill.
Okay. So Chimp Empire is your homework assignment.
Okay. Tell me about it, because I know a lot about chimps. I just haven't seen
Oh my God. It's just so brilliant. It's like one of those documentaries that I watched, and then once it was finished, I watched it again. I don't want to spoiler alert it.
Anyone. Spoiler alert for anybody listening.
It says so much about human nature. I'm not gonna. You have to watch it.
No, please, because
I'm
about to hit you with chimp facts. So if you don't give me your counter facts,
no. Well, it's human nature.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna spoil it because it's too good. It's
but
4
is it
hours.
chimps acting well and disarming?
No.
Yes.
No.
It is.
No.
Chimps tearing each other limb from limb.
Somebody once said to me, we're jumping around here, but the Bilyeu, the Surprise Kill Vanish book I write about an organization called Ground Branch inside of the CIA, inside of its Special Activities Division, that are, it's an incredibly powerful, incredibly frightening direct action group that does not adhere to rule of law or military rule. They have their own Title 50. So they're really wild. It's just a great, that's the best way they're just wild. And someone asked me what I thought of Chimp Empire, and I said, this is the best way I can describe it to you without giving it away. It's the origin story of Ground Branch.
So is this you agreeing that we wouldn't be able to get to nuke zero because humans are aggressive?
No, because that was millions of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Those are our ancestors from millions of years ago. We have evolved. In the end of the book, Nuclear War, I write about nuclear winter, and then I take us to this ancient archaeological site called Göbekli Tepe. And it's the oldest known archaeological site made by man that exists. And when it was discovered in the 1990s by a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt and his young student Michael Morsch, whom I interview in the book because I love to get things from the first-hand POV, the discovery of Göbekli Tepe upended the general thinking among all archaeologists, among all anthropologists, about how man became civilized. The idea before that was man was hunter-gatherers. So, after chimps, we move, then we become hunter-gatherers, and then we become civilized, and then we invent writing. And then the rest is history, literally, because once writing happened, we have history. So the idea was man needed to be able to domesticate animals and have agriculture in order to then keep progressing and develop language. So it's a continuum that thought and the development of tools and the development of the brain and the development of community is progress. We can all kind of agree on that. But Göbekli Tepe disrupted that because the sort of iconography in the carved stones suggest that the people that built Göbekli Tepe, and it's this, you can see a picture of it in the book. It's like an amphitheater made of stone, and there's multiple amphitheaters, and they have these 20-foot tall carved pillars that represent man or gods, who knows. But this group, 12,000 years ago, were still hunter-gatherers. The carvings on the stones are like ibis and crane and fox, wild animals. Jaguars, not cows and goats and pigs, domesticated animals, chickens. And so archaeologists and anthropologists have to accept this was a hunter-gatherer group that built a civilization, in essence. You can't have, it required plans. And so it just like suddenly you have to rejigger your thinking about man and his nature. And I've gone off on a tangent, but the point to this is I believe that man does evolve, even though how we get there are big gaps in our thinking and understanding because we simply can't know if it's not written down. But progress is always being made. And after I take the reader through this idea of Göbekli Tepe after a nuclear winter, and I try to have like a thought experiment where I ask readers to think about how we, in this century, archaeologists came upon Göbekli Tepe and were like, my God, what was going on here? We don't know, but we wonder, and it's so inspiring on the one hand to think about, and it fills in mysteries. And I then was imagine thousands of years in the future, after nuclear war, after nuclear winter, after the ruin of civilization, after man returns to a hunter-gatherer state, which would almost certainly happen. Will the future men become archaeologists? Will they find remnants of our society? And will they wonder, what were they up to? And the reason I posit that is because I believe that people can take away what Einstein said of nuclear weapons when he was asked, what weapons will World War III be fought with? And he said, I don't know, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Einstein's idea that all these thousands of years of man's progress, all the movement we've made in our civilizations, could be whoosh, in the blink of an eye in a nuclear war. What a great tragedy. So then you must say, how do we change that? If you're me, you would say, having learned what I learned, disarmament. Sounds like what you're saying is deterrence. So maybe those are just two sides of the same coin.
Well, so after having read your book, I took away a thesis, which may be part of my fundamental misunderstanding of you, which is that while I would be lying if I said I believed that you don't have a thesis, that maybe this is just something that's fascinating to you and you don't care one way or the other. But the book very much read to me like a warning. This read like, especially because you end with, is it Göbekli Tepe, which is what I've always thought, or is it? Can you look this up, Drew?
It's Göbekli Tepe because Tep means hill. Yeah.
The reason that I thought you ended with that was trying to give us like a earthbound pale blue dot moment of imagine that we do this, we destroy everything, and one day people find evidence of our civilization and begin asking questions, what the hell happened? Which is a really interesting way to poke us into being way more thoughtful.
Yes.
This goes back to your book felt like a story-based version of what Eric Weinstein has hypothesized. He hasn't said we should do this, but he said maybe we should start doing above-ground nuclear testing so people don't forget how unbelievably dangerous nuclear weapons are. And that's what I got reading the book, was between the just minute-by-minute breakdown of how devastating this would be, from radiation poisoning, your skin being ripped off, people getting sucked up into the cone of the mushroom cloud. I mean, just really, really fascinating levels of detail, how far, like 5 miles of fire, nothing cellular exists in that 5-mile radius, just really, really detailed. And then the pale blue dot moment of imagine being a failed civilization that people are looking back on. It was like, okay, hey, everybody, back off. What I'm saying is we can't. So we might reduce
You're saying
the number.
we can't back off.
Humans as a species, it will not work. Is
your position.
My
right.
position, yeah. Now the question becomes, okay, Tom, how did you come to that position? And I will posit it to you as a question. I would look back at history. I think history is the greatest predictor of our future. Up until AI, if we begin doing genetic engineering, then all bets are off the table and there really is a singularity and I can't see beyond it. But up until that moment, history is the greatest predictor of where we're going as far as I'm concerned. And if I look backwards, I see only people pushing the advantage, getting what they can, brief periods of stability followed by instability, and you get that cycle that everybody is so fond of repeating, that good men make good times make weak men make hard times make good men, so on and so forth. So that it exists in this loop. So, hey, we've just had this period of stability that lasted roughly 70 years. It may just be that that's drawing to a close. And just like when we look back at history, it is a never-ending loop of death and destruction. For anybody that has not looked at history, it's really pretty, terrifying in its predictive ability of what humans are going to be like today. So when you look, one, do you think looking backwards is wise to understand where we are going? And if so, what do you see when you look backwards that gives you hope about disarmament?
Maybe there are two different lanes of thought. So sometimes I think it's a predisposition that I have toward optimism. So I have read many of those ideas, and I've had conversations with people that believe, like what you're saying, that it's this cycle of sort of man, the aggressor. The best example I can think about that is a guy called John von Neumann, who was the original Pentagon's brain. I write about him. He was just so incredibly smart. But he believed in his nature that man was violent and prone to violent acts. He was a game theorist, and interestingly, it's where we got a lot of the game theory about nuclear war in the 50s, prisoner's dilemma, etc. And he attracted people who were like-minded, who peopled the Defense Department, who built up our nuclear weapon systems. So I think that a fundamental shift is definitely in order if you want to have change, have things be different. But I do also, so there's that lane, right, sort of man's nature. But then there's another lane of the radical speed of technology, the Moore's law of it, that is happening right in our own lives, that you cannot argue makes this era stand out, I believe. When you look at the slow crawl of evolution, I mean, of in industry with happening. And you look at where we are now with science and technology, it's just astonishing. And so I believe that that looking to, that's kind of looping into your AI theory, that it is possible for history to go in a new and different direction. But you have to have thought leaders who are not all of the von Neumann ilk. You have to have both kinds of people. You know, for the sake of argument, we can call them like the negativists and the positivists, right? Or those who see man as naturally aggressive, and those who see, well, we can get along. We're no longer, I mean, Chimp Empire, you gotta watch it. It's just 50 chimps, right? They can't be 5,000 chimps. It doesn't work. So we can work as five, you know. So, but it has to have a fundamental shift in thinking. Now, to my eye, that would be an argument for why it's really important to be able to have friends on both sides of the aisle. To be able to have, you know, people with fundamentally opposing ideas hashing out what the future of nuclear command and control could or should look like. But as our society becomes increasingly adversarial, and I'm just talking about America, I'm not talking about the whole world, as our society becomes, you know, even more polarized and adversarial, then I think that becomes more and more of a problem. And then I would see things pessimistically. I would be inclined. But that would be by man's own demise. So if there's any takeaway, not necessarily inside my book, but in reading my books and having conversations with others about them, would be that you can have the takeaway and have precisely, you know, have exactly opposite ideas, which you have a different takeaway from my book than I do, which is exactly the point. Because we're not sitting here shouting at each other. We don't disagree, we just see things differently. There's a difference.
Yeah, I'm not even sure if we do have a different takeaway. Let me ask,
Yeah.
do you consider nuclear zero possible or simply desirable?
The colleagues that I have met recently that are of the disarmament ilk, I have read their statements, and what they say is that what is possible is reducing nuclear weapons to zero. So what I see in that is I focus on the part of reducing. Since I don't have to have a goal in that race. I can just be part of a movement or support, because the other alternative, which is what's happening, let's spend $1 trillion, you know, upgrading our weapon systems, which by the way antagonizes everybody around the world, and that only moves things in this direction. So the takeaway from my book, no doubt, is we are one misunderstanding or miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation. That is really clear to me after having written the book. More so than any book I have ever written, it has a conclusion, and that is it. Mm. And so moving in that direction is just perpetuating the risk. Moving in that direction is reducing it.
If you were emperor, if you were emperor of America, let's say, and you don't have to convince Congress, the Senate, the voters, nothing. You're just going to do a thing. What would you do to our nuclear armament? We'll start there.
I could never be emperor. I'm not suited to be emperor. You want people to be good at the job that they have, and that's not my makeup. It's like asking me if I could be an astronaut. I would become completely claustrophobic.
Would you be good at advising the emperor?
I could maybe offer a little advice, but I would be one of many people offering advice.
Sure, fair,
right?
Wise. What would you advise as one of the voices to the emperor? What would you advise that they do?
Specifically,
go to zero, reduce slowly, do a tit-for-tat reduction so that, hey, Russia, North Korea, Israel, France, China, all of the people that have nuclear weapons, like we reduce in kind. And if I see you reducing and you let me send people in to verify, then we'll reduce.
I would probably not get that specific. I would probably quote Dr. Carlos Umana, who I met recently in Brussels, who won the Nobel, was one of the recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. He's a physician, part of the group of the Physicians Against Nuclear Weapons. And what he said to me was, start with an idea, which is interesting because we are talking about ideas. Start with an idea. So as advisor to emperor, I would repeat him and say, before you go there, start with the idea of making something taboo, because that is a powerful concept that people can wrap their head around, and then it has an example. So in other words, we're talking about weapons of mass destruction. Biological weapons and chemical weapons used to be viable arsenals that the United States government had. They have since become taboo. No one says, let's have a really great arsenal of weaponized smallpox on reserve. So in case somebody else wants to launch a bunch of weapons at us with smallpox, weaponized smallpox, we can do ours in return. And that'll keep us all from ever using these. We all know how crazy that is. That's just absolutely taboo. I mean, you'd have to be really living outside of the general norm to think that was a good idea. And yet, people still work from the idea, we're talking about it right now, that having a new weapon, a giant, vast arsenal of nuclear weapons, 5,000 of them, by the way, we have, Russia has approximately 5,000, is a perfectly good idea. If you can, what Dr. Umana suggested is if you can present the idea of taboo into the discussion, then you have a place that people can work from. And they can go, oh, that makes sense. And when I think about the smallpox concept, I think about there are still a few samples of smallpox in BSL-4 labs around the world. Very dangerous, but they exist. Actually, they didn't for a while, and now they do. You know, let's use a different example, or you get the idea.
Yeah.
And so having a few samples and a few vials is very different than having biological weapons loaded onto warheads ready to go, which we used to have and Russia used to have as well. And North Korea has, by the way, right now. And so taboo would be what I would tell the emperor. Think about taboo. And then that reduction makes sense in a graduated way. And once we're down to 1, decide whether, or 5, decide whether it's really 0. And in the graduated process, you would see the other nuclear-armed nations responding. And then, ultimately, what would really be going on is you'd all be working together. Instead of, you could be adversaries, you could be opponents, you could fundamentally disagree with communism, as I do, but we all share this blue dot, as you say. And so let's work together to reduce a threat, as opposed to, you're my enemy and I might have to kill you.
I love that. I think that the idea of taboo is extraordinarily good advice. If done in a way where you were what I'll round to tit for tat. We do it, you let people come in and look at your arsenal and see if it's actually reducing. I do want to know though, do you feel you have earned your optimism, or is this just a default stance that you were blessed with?
Probably the latter. It's just how I think. And also, I personally think it's actually a better way to think. So when I begin to think pessimistically, it's time for a hike.
So I'll put forth that pessimism is not the only other option, because I am very much not a pessimist.
Okay.
I would have called myself an optimist up until this interview, and now I'm realizing maybe I'm not an optimist. I am a realist, but I don't mean that in a self-congratulatory way. I mean it in that I can't necessarily see what is real, but I'm simply groping for what is real. And so I'm doing things like, okay, what am I going to use to inform my stance on this? Looking backwards is certainly one of the things. So I look back at history. Do I see periods of peace? Yes. Do I see a period of peace that ever lasted and wasn't violated? No. Not ever, not once. Nope, never, not once. So I would now be asking for the first time ever in human history for people to be able to sort of put a genie back in the bottle. Yes, that's what you're asking. Okay, doesn't mean that you don't try it, but it does mean that you go into this saying, okay, this is violating everything that I know about human behavior up to this point, but is there a plan that we can put together? Because if you don't believe it can be done, you won't even take the steps, which is why I think that your idea of making it taboo is really quite brilliant. And I get you're quoting somebody else, fair enough, but still, nonetheless, I think the idea is really, really fantastic. Your book, however, posits a madman, and that is exactly the thing that I think people are ultimately going to bump up against. So there are 9 countries with nuclear weapons. One of them will not let people come in and audit. That would be North Korea. I think there's a reason that your book says, hey, this probably starts with North Korea, the one person that's just sort of leaving things unhinged. Also, I think we did make using nuclear weapons taboo. I know there was a huge debate during Vietnam whether we halo dropped a nuclear weapon in there to just end that war real quick. We decided not to, probably very wise, in that it just, the more conflicts we've had where nobody used them, the more we go, okay, wow, it really is. There'd be so much international pressure. However, we're now living in a moment where people really are rattling their sabers again, talking about using them, whether our own president or anybody else. It's certainly now less taboo to talk about it. And I certainly have deep fears that Putin gets backed into a corner, feels it's an existential threat, and maybe doesn't use an ICBM, but a little dirty bomb or something just to make a point to let people know to back off. And now all of a sudden it isn't taboo and potentially escalates from there. That would be a very deep and profound concern. But thinking about all of that, with my realist hat on, I worry that not only will we never get to 0 nukes, but that as synthetic biology becomes more powerful, that China really will go, here's an Anglo-targeted version of Ebola that's airborne or whatever, and we're like, yo, our spies told us that they developed that, so we need one aimed at Chinese people, and so now everybody does keep that in a secret lab, and I don't know where you fall on conspiracy theories around COVID, but were we doing gain-of-function research? Does that make sense? So we already have reason to at least be a little bit cautious about assuming that people aren't already keeping things, maybe not smallpox, but things like smallpox on hand, just in case, under the guise of, oh, we're just trying to learn about it. And so I have a very, what I'll call Matt Ridley's version of the rational optimist in me, where I look back and I see, despite all the horrible things and the brutal, terrible things that we've done to each other, humans are also beautiful and wonderful and full of love and capable of the incredible. And so I don't want to look back at 12,000 years of moving in the right direction with, there's no doubt, brutal blips that for any one person's life, it doesn't help that the long arc bends towards justice for all. But I think looking back and just seeing this progress, that I continue to believe that that's going to continue. But I have a feeling it will only continue if people look at the world not as they wish it were, but as it actually is. And so taking a very practical, maybe just the nice neutral term for it, a practical approach to how do we de-escalate, how do we increase the sense of taboo, ends up being how we at least continue this 70-year run of good luck.
And to your point about taboo, another reason why it would be very valuable is that you could, first of all, it would keep more nations from getting nuclear weapons, period. because you would be the group of 9, or rather 8, because North Korea doesn't participate, would be having a stance, a unified stance. And if once you have to be unified about something, ideally you would be unified about other things, because that's how progress happens. So one of the problems right now, as you say, of Putin being backed in the corner, is that making, friends with other enemies becomes even more dangerous. The missile that I write about, the ICBM, that hits the Pentagon is an Hwasong-17, North Korea's now second most powerful long-range nuclear weapon. Just the other day in the news, I read that Hwasong-11, a shorter range missile, hit Ukraine. Now, this happened several months ago, but the forensics were being done on it to make sure this was accurate. And it was reported earlier this week that it was. And so what that says is you now have, Russia and North Korea friending up in the weapons world to attack Ukraine.
I assume it was a conventional warhead?
Yes. It was a conventional warhead, but still, those are the delivery systems of nuclear weapons. And the bigger point is they're friends. If you could make the person who isn't adhering to the deterrence rules, to the disarmament rules, taboo, it would put more pressure on them to join the group. Watch Chimp Empire. Versus people cutting deals with, when everybody's enemies of everybody else, the potential for explosion, the potential for serious conflicts escalating gets greater. When people communicate and when people have agreements about things, it lessens the pressure.
Why don't we build an Iron Dome style defense system? I know we have something that's sort of the beginnings of it, but why isn't that the answer here?
So America has, well, first of all, for listeners, there's a difference between an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, which can get from one continent to another in roughly 30 minutes. It's mind-boggling. That technology has not changed since 1957, by the way. People talk about, we have hypersonics. A ballistic missile is hypersonic. And it's faster than a hypersonic. The new missiles, those are Mach, 5, 6, something like that. A ballistic missile is going about 15,000 miles an hour, Mach 23. Short range and intermediate range missiles are easier to shoot down. That is what you saw 2 weeks ago in Iran firing missiles at Israel. You saw them being shot down by Navy systems out on the ocean called the Aegis system, which can shoot down those missiles. I write about them in the book because they have an 85% success rate, but they're not protecting the continental United States. They're protecting our partners overseas. And so the Aegis systems, which had the 85% success rate, actually worked in a live combat situation. So if you're me thinking about disarmament, you go, wow, now a lot of people are going, we should just have those. But the Aegis system cannot go up against an intercontinental ballistic missile. An intercontinental ballistic missile gets intercepted by what's called an interceptor missile. And I write about in the book how that goes down. We have 44 total. Many people have said, maybe, Annie, there's a secret program you don't know about. Doesn't exist. Unless I'm wrong. It doesn't exist. Even if it did, tell me where those 1,500 some odd or 2,000 missiles are hiding. They have to be somewhere. So we know Russia has 5,000 missiles. How is 44 interceptor missiles going to go up against them? Never mind the fact that the warhead in a nose cone of a missile can be MIRV, meaning there are multiple warheads in there. There are decoys in there. The interceptor missile system, by the Defense Department's own records, has a success rate of between 40 and 55%. Those are on curated tests. That's when it's like, hey guys, there's going to be a missile coming at 8 o'clock. Try to shoot it down. Literally, a curated test. 50% failure rate, approximately.
But you don't think the play is to put resources into getting better? I'm operating on the base assumption that if we had the Manhattan Project of stopping, or the Manhattan Project of creating an Iron Dome essentially for these, that we could get better. Now, whether there's a lot better that we could get, I won't speak to, but my base assumption is that yes, with enough time and energy, we could. But I know it's on strategic pause, so they're not even trying.
Well, they are. They're creating a whole new system. But the thing is that how many of them are you going to have? Mostly they're all for show, really and truly. And most people, by the way, do not even realize this. I have even said in an interview before, I was at a dinner party with a very knowledgeable person. When I told him I was writing this book, it was like, Annie, we have an interceptor system for that.
Whoa.
Did not say anything. That person used to be a staffer for a member of Congress. Just simply was completely wrong. It's okay. People have different sets of wrong information. But we have 44 interceptor missiles. And they cannot shoot down 1,000 incoming missiles. And so to your point, if we, okay, so that becomes a great idea. Let's have twice as many missiles. Well, then that is exactly what a certain group of military industrialists would love to perhaps have happen. More weapons, more weapons, more weapons. But I know nothing about the economics you spoke of printing money. It sounded interesting. But what I can tell you is you could just replace printing money with making weapons. Anyone can tell you. You just need a narrative brain to be like, wait a minute. If we make more weapons, they're going to make more weapons. And so that is madness when you're talking about nuclear weapons. That is madness. The goal must be, I would think, based on what sources tell me, disarmament.
Yeah, well, we'll see if we can pull that off. It is a great goal to aim for. Speaking of goals, talk to me about the next era of weaponry. You've talked about DARPA. Their sole mission in life is to build, I forget the exact phrase, but like the next generation of the most amazing weaponry. Do we have hints of what comes next? Drones, autonomous systems, AI warfare, anything like that?
Vast weapon systems of the future. That's the quote. Vast weapon systems of the future. DARPA is, of course, for listeners, the most powerful, most productive military research agency in the world. And they handle chicken and egg problems. Those are their words. Or they do blue sky research, because the fundamental theory is if one of your, call it an adversary, call it an enemy, if one of your enemies or adversaries appears on the scene with a weapon that you don't have, it's too late. That's DARPA's thinking. And so they are creating weapon systems to outperform anyone at all times. And they work directly with the intelligence community to have an eye on what weapon systems are being created over there in China, Russia, North Korea. So when I wrote the DARPA book and was reporting it 10 years ago, I found these very interesting, to me, documents in the Defense Department making explicitly clear that the weapons systems of the future were going to be autonomous systems that involved not just machines that become intelligent, but humans that interface with machines.
Like brain-computer interface?
Brain-computer interface. And you can read the DARPA book called The Pentagon's Brain, which is now 10 years old. But again, I take you through the origin stories of DARPA and show you the different weapon systems in the different wars that came to be. And I think most readers can then figure out for themselves where we're going. It's the Shakespeare past as prologue, like you said as well. And so the idea that DARPA is moving toward is to have humans and machines work together. And that includes ultimately biohybrids, where men and women, I use the word man to mean humans, are augmented with machines. And this doesn't just mean in the brain, this also means in the body. And this also means that warfighters will carry technology kits to be able to do all kinds of things, from identify their enemies instantly through iris scans. I mean, all of this works together with biometric databases. I wrote about this in the book I wrote previously, right before nuclear war. I wrote a book called First Platoon, about a group of young soldiers that go to Afghanistan thinking they're fighting the Taliban, only to discover that they're actually collecting biometric information on locals as part of a program that the Defense Department was running to collect biometric information. That's your fingerprints, iris scans, DNA on 85% of the population of Afghanistan. It was just a big litmus test, in essence. And so this idea, if there's anything people might want to sort of look at, I believe, to wonder where all of this is going, it's biometric systems working in concert with brain-computer interface systems at the Pentagon. And that becomes a world, not just, fill in the blank with the I saw your science fiction books on the shelf before we spoke. That is precisely the direction in which DARPA would have us heading. But let's not forget a quote from the former director of DARPA herself, which said, DARPA, where science fiction becomes science fact.
How taboo do you think transhumanism, brain-computer interfaces to move weapons is going to become?
How taboo?
Yeah.
Well, again, it's what people decide is taboo. Taboo is taboo is a completely human construct. And so I'll cite a kind of spooky example that I also found when I wondered that question. And there is a survey I write about in the Pentagon's brain where the generals and admirals at the Pentagon, so the high-ranking officers, were asked how they felt about this movement toward, brain-computer interface, AI, weapon systems of the future being drone swarms, humans being augmented with computers themselves, super soldiers is kind of the short form term for it. And the generals and the admirals gave pushback in this discussion, said, we don't want that. We want to always have a human in the mix. And what I found, that was the end of that study. And then what I found was right around the same time, DARPA became very interested in a scientist that was working on, he had discovered, in his own words, something called the moral molecule. I got to give an addendum there to the other concept. The generals basically said, we want a human in the mix because we don't trust machines. Then at the same time, I find this new program that gets initiated at DARPA with the professor, Zach, who found to his he alleged to find the moral molecule in the brain. It's something called oxytocin. And he was thrilled to have found this. It's the same molecule, the way that Zach explained it to me, because I interviewed him in his office. It's the same molecule that breastfeeding mothers emit. So it's just trust. And it had to exist if we go back to our hunter-gatherer discussion, because imagine a breastfeeding mother who has to worry about like the wildebeest or the lion or the jaguar, but has to take the time to breastfeed the child so that evolution can continue. Well, there's the moral molecule. Trust. It's okay. Everything will be fine. The wildebeest will not get you. mean, that's how I think of it when I try to wrap my brain around what that molecule might be. And so DARPA gives Zach a grant to investigate the moral molecule so that, and to his eye, he told me he was convinced it was so that they could understand how to make people more trusting. I posit a different idea, which is that it was going to be used to try and make people trust the Pentagon and trust that brain-computer interface was a good idea. And I have lots of reasons why I have lots of reasons that I report that indicate that that was the direction that it was going. But again, readers can draw their own conclusion.
So interesting that you have that, but are still very hesitant to say that the government might be up to something. Certainly in this case, that the Pentagon might be up to something. It's interesting. Yeah, so getting people to understand how these things work, that the government is running these experiments, that you have this gigantic part of the military apparatus that has a instruction or reason for existing to create these vast weapon systems of the future, and that they're playing around with oxytocin, which, by the way, is also present in post-orgasm brain chemistry. So to the point about bonding, it's there to bond the mother and the infant. It's there to bond the two people making love. So yeah, and you can use it as a nasal spray, which is crazy. So in fact, I brought this up to my wife once. So I had a doctor that was like, hey, if you want to experiment with it, I'll prescribe oxytocin for you as a nasal spray. And I went to my wife and I was like, oh my God, this would be so amazing. Like, imagine we want to have a really hard conversation, or we want to negotiate. We're, you know, Putin and Biden, and we want to negotiate backing off of nuclear armament. We're each going to take a nasal spray of oxytocin, or let's be clandestine. We're just going to pump it into the room.
Wow.
And now everyone's just like a little more trusting and open to it. I mean, it's interesting. I am very curious to know if any of this stuff ever plays out realistically. Like, I know, for instance, you wrote a book, Phenomena, on the government studying ESP. So whether it's ESP or oxytocin, like, does this stuff get researched because there's so many dollars floating around, or do they actually do something with this stuff?
I mean, I think, again, it's, you know, case specific. I write about different programs that become the result of other programs, but there is the idea that a lot of what the most volatile, shall we say, programs get classified. And again, now you can take away from that what you will. What I do know about DARPA is it's fundamental that it's working on weapon systems of the future. And what I do know about DARPA is that it comes from the position that if we don't invent it, someone else will. And so that, like, I'll loop it back to nuclear war because it's so on my mind, is this thermonuclear bomb here on the cover of the book. The weapon drawn by Richard Garwin when he was 23 or 24 years old. The first thermonuclear explosion. The explosion that changed the world, you could say. I asked Garwin if he wished he hadn't invented it. And he said to me, after a very long pause, he wished it couldn't be invented.
Why do you think he said that?
I wonder about that, and I specifically didn't want to ask him a follow-up because I enjoy thinking that there's two answers, and right, which is that one, which other nuclear weapons designers have told me, is, Annie, the Russians were months away from from discovering or being able to explode a thermonuclear weapon, which is true. So there's that. And then there's the idea of the pure scientist mind, which is not my mind, which is, that's my calling. So it's like, and I guess the closest analogy I can think is like, I am a storyteller. I was born that way. I've always known about myself that is me. And nothing gives me greater inspiration and excitement and purpose, really. And so I can't imagine if somebody said, oh, you can't write that story, you're not allowed. And in an interesting way, I faced a little bit of that with nuclear war, a scenario, in as much that there was some concern that I was fear-mongering. There's two concerns that were presented to me by, very level-headed people. Like, one, is it fear-mongering? And two, are you giving anyone any idea? And my answer to the first part was, well, let me ask my sources. Am I fear-mongering? Which I did, which was super helpful. And no one said to me, yes, don't write that book. None of them. These are people in nuclear command and control. And to the second part, am I giving anyone an idea? It's like, people with bad intention know all of this. And so, but circling back to the idea of, do I wish it could not be invented? I think that's the where my mind goes on that question is about the part of our discussion about man evolving, man moving toward a world led by science and technology. That is the reality of where we are. You think back to the word Luddite, right? Because when sometimes people get afraid by that, and they're like, this is terrible, it used to be better before. And then you think of, I looked up the other day what an actual Luddite, it's like I think it was the weaving loom was invented. People went crazy. Like, oh my God, this is just going to ruin it for the pre-weavers. Same with the printing press. I've heard one of my favorite thinkers, James Burke, talk about the printing press, and he was talking to Dan Carlin on Hardcore History, and he was saying that, and he's an optimist, by the way, he was saying that when people say to him, like, oh my God, the iPhone is ruining America, and he said, when the printing press was invented, everybody said, this is going to ruin youth. Suddenly they're going to be able to read. And we laugh at that now. But, what Burke said on the counterpoint up to that was that what the printing press did was liberate the world, because liberate the world and give the world access to knowledge. Not just because average Jane and Joe could read, but because before that, the priesthood controlled the information. And what a great way of thinking. So science and technology, where we are now, is no different than the printing press and Burke's idea about how that made society better. And so I think that kind of looping around to your transhumanism question is that, again, you can frame your thinking in any manner. I can think, oh my God, it's the worst thing in the world to suddenly augment humans. Or I can think, that's part of progress. But the most important thing is my favorite expression of all time, and probably sums me up better than anything. And even my own father said, this is my favorite new expression. Just don't make me do it. Just don't make me do it.
Tell me more. That sums you up better than anything?
Because I can hold both ideas. Maybe transhumanism is great. Maybe it's terrible. But ultimately, it's my decision. So just don't make me do it. So whenever I hear any bad, like what I think are bad ideas, I can, okay, interesting. That's interesting. I can listen to them. Interesting. Okay. Ask questions. So then if that da-da-da-da-da. And then my conclusion is not that is right or wrong. I mean, within reason. Some things are, okay. I'm talking about like acceptable concepts. But then I say, just don't make me do it.
Right. Just don't make me
Don't make me do it.
That's very interesting. Okay. A couple of things that you said really sum up where I'm at. And I think it's interesting how it also highlights the different interpretations that we have. So you said, if we don't invent it, someone else will. That's what's driving the creation of a lot of these technologies. That's very much an idea that underpins my thinking as well, that take the atomic bomb. If we didn't, the Germans were racing to do it. And then when they fell out of the game, the Russians were racing to do it. In fact, they had a spy at Los Alamos, which is probably how they got it. They were also trying to gobble up as many of the former Nazi scientists as they could. And so it's a race to get all the Germans, which is a fascinating question about why did the Germans have all the best scientists, but that's a whole different thing. And then the other was a quote that you said, which I wish it couldn't have been invented. I forget the gentleman's name. But
Richard
so
Garwin.
You put Garwin's quote together with the driving ethos of, if we don't do it, somebody else is going to, and you get everything that can be invented will be invented. I know somebody, I hope this doesn't become self-evident, I know somebody who is very well versed in physics that worries that certain insights in physics will give birth to the unknown. So just as Einstein's insights end up leading to the splitting of the atom, and then that leads not only to energy, it also leads to weapons of mass destruction. And the age that we're in, you know, as we find new things, like what's the new Manhattan Project? Like, are they working on something? And if they are, is it going to have positive, negative implications? It's very hard to know. But I firmly believe that the way the human mind works, if it can be invented, it's going to be invented. But where we put resources will determine how quickly something is invented. So certainly there are ways to forestall. But if you have the idea that if we don't do it, somebody else will. Now, all of a sudden, you take the biggest, most dangerous thing, the thing that could be the vast weapon system of the future, and you go crazy. So take AI. Partly because I guess I've grown up in the age where it seemed like in the 80s, for real, we were all going to die from a nuclear explosion, and then it didn't happen. I have a false sense of security that we're going to just keep figuring this out and not do it, because mutually assured destruction makes so much sense to me that even a madman, unless they absolutely care about nothing, but I have a hard time believing that they would get in power. Anyway, I don't have, maybe wrongly so, this is one where I do not want people to adopt my thinking. I think that your book is a very wise thing that if people listen to and we reduce, we're in a way better position. But anyway, that isn't where I spend a lot of my time being afraid. But I do spend time being very concerned about the psychological impact of AI. Now, I am a huge proponent of AI, ironically. I think that ultimately it ends up being a tremendous force for good. You couldn't stop it from happening even if you wanted to anyway. So I think people ought to think about how to do it well. But I think there will be a transition period that's going to be ruthless. And so when you were talking about the printing press, yes, we look back and laugh now, but they were right. And so the generation where the clergy lost control of the church was explosive. It changed the very fabric of society. And whenever you change the fabric of society, even though it leads to something that I think universally we would all say is better, it would have been devastating for social structure at that time. And given how little the average human likes change, you can understand why those would be very turbulent times. In addition to that, the rate of change now is accelerating so much that even if we embrace that, oh, change is great, this is all going to be wonderful, AI is going to bring in, if not a utopia, something just so much better than what we have today, and it's a liberation in the same way that people were liberated by the loom first and the printing press first, but anyway, you get the idea. If that all happens at the rate that AI is going to happen, and then AI will self-improve, I think just the rate of change alone will be very hard to metabolize for human civilization.
I don't disagree with you, and I think that would be another vote for people beginning to realize how important it is to see people as adversaries and opponents as opposed to enemies. Because if everything, it's the old cliche, if you're a hammer, everything's a nail. And so what I take away from what you were saying was AI could be weaponized or AI could be generalized, right? It could be a tool for people to use, or it could be a weapon. And that's just the fundamental reality of dual use. And all weapons, almost all weapons have a dual use. So the thrust should be on a sort of human level of being able to communicate and agree to disagree as opposed to having conflict. And the problem with the military-industrial complex, and when I say that, I don't mean that in a conspiratorial way, I mean that in a literal way. Weapons production, right? A colleague I know works for Raytheon, and they just got rid of all their advertising, essentially their whole advertising department, because they don't need to advertise anymore. They just are back-ordered on weapons. So if weapons require conflict, so on balance, if people are moving toward a degree of, I don't want to say harmony because that sounds very Pollyanna-ish, but rather communication or agreeing on their differences, then I think the framework of inventions of technologies become different. And again, you would make it taboo. Like, what? You're trying to use that as a weapon? That's, right? So there's no taboo in weaponry whatsoever. And I'm even shocked by that just in my progression as a reporter over the past 20 years. I'll give the most obvious example being drones. When drones first came out, and I reported on the earliest days of the drones and the initial drone that was during the Clinton administration that a group of people I interviewed, I write about this in Surprise, Kill, Vanish, wanted to kill Osama bin Laden with a drone. And we're told, no, that you can't do that. And look at now. Drones are just completely accepted as part of the vast weapon systems of the present day.
What was the rationale behind not using it to kill bin Laden?
Because it would just be absolutely unacceptable. This was in the late 90s.
Because there's no human attached?
It's almost impossible to think about this now.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So
right?
disorienting.
Right? Because, are you ready for this? It was an extrajudicial killing.
Huh.
And the President Clinton at the time, wanted the team to take along an FBI agent. So they wanted to grab bin Laden. They could get him human.
This is before 9/11? Interesting. I didn't realize he was that kind of threat before 9/11.
Bilyeu was operating against bin Laden 10 years before 9/11 in Sudan.
Huh.
The CIA knew he was a threat immediately after the Gulf War. And they were watching him, and Bilyeu, there's a great part in Surprise, Kill, Vanish of Bilyeu. His cover was an old man on a jogging craze. That's how he described it. He wasn't that old then. But he would just run around Khartoum in jogging shorts, and he had to have a lead pipe in his hand while he was running because bin Laden's dogs would always run after him. I mean, it's just such a great image and such a great scene. Bilyeu wanted to kill bin Laden and asked, there's two versions of that story. There's two versions of everything. Bilyeu's version of the story was that he told his boss, Cofer Black. Cofer Black became a very famous person during the War on Terror for a lot of reasons. But Cofer Black was chief of station in Khartoum in the 90s, and Billy was the singleton operator going up against bin Laden. And Billy said, we should kill this guy, according to Billy. And he had a whole plan how he was going to do it, throw a bunch of grenades over, go over the fence. And he told, according to Billy, he told Cofer Black. Cofer Black took it directly to the president. And the president said, don't ever suggest anything like that again. This is Clinton. Ever. Right? Like, Billy got sort of admonished for suggesting that. That's Billy's version. Cofer's version is, I never took it to Clinton. But either way, what we do know is that some years later, that same team tried to kill bin Laden with a drone, and it was rejected because drones were taboo. Drones were taboo. It was just considered out of the realm of human behavior.
It's so taboo. Let's talk about it. Billy would Billy was an assassin. For people that don't know, Billy would, I think it was Billy that said when you saw that he had a knife, oh God, this might have been somebody else, but you were like, why do you have a knife instead of guns? Because some operations have to be done quietly. So why do you think, now I'm asking you as a writer, as somebody who understands other people, gets inside their head, explain to me an assassin and how they can wrap their head around killing somebody and feeling like this was or is justified.
Okay, so a couple thoughts on that. I mean, assassin is such a, narrative word. Billy never called himself an assassin. I never called Billy an assassin.
How did he refer to himself?
Well, but hang on. So, however, and we used to have this discussion, and I would try to get some details from him, and he would usually say, I can't talk about that. And you are right. Someone once said, this guy killed more people than cancer, right? So there was definitely a suggestion.
If you love coffee and a little bit of caffeine, but hate the jitters and that afternoon crash that comes with it, there is finally a coffee replacement that you've got to try. It's from Peak and it's called Nandica. Nandica is made from the highest quality ingredients and claims to activate your metabolism, promote healthy levels of testosterone production, and provide sustained energy without the jitters or a crash. With slow release caffeine that comes from fermented probiotic teas, Nandica delivers an energy boost that lasts throughout the day so you can stay focused and productive. Peak has well over 15,000 5-star reviews, and for a limited time you can get up to 15% off plus a free rechargeable frother and cup with my link peaklife.com/impact. Click the link in the description or go directly to peaklife.com/impact to get up to 15% off plus 2 free gifts.
I was interested in reporting Billy's story, and I was more interested in the long form of the story. And asking that kind of point-blank question is a really quick way to get somebody like Bilyeu to say, we're done here. And that's it. So, and I knew it was more valuable for me to get the real big, long arc of Bilyeu and let people decide if he was a, air quote, assassins. With that said, I was at Billy's house in Florida one day, and he was showing me, all various weapons, and he had all kinds of artifacts framed on the walls. He had so many awards. And I came upon an award of beautifully framed, silver-gilded Persian sword, framed with a big medallion from the CIA. And an inscription that said, to Bilyeu, the assassin. And I describe exactly in the book, Surprise, Kill, Vanish, what it said. But I pointed to it and said, Billy, what about this? And he told me a little bit about it. You can read it in the book. But he never used that word himself. That's a word that was given to him, interestingly, by the agency.
So setting the word aside for a second, how did he think about killing? Was he obviously operated on some kind of code? I'll do whatever I need to do to protect my country, or this is a bad person, they have it coming, or. Do you have a sense of how he conceptualized the job?
I mean, Billy, first of all, he began operating when Eisenhower was president. Assassination truly was still legal, meaning the CIA has a code called Title 50 that they adhere to. The military works under Title 10. And Title 50 is part of the president's, what is called, the third option. So there's diplomacy, that's the first option. Then there's war, it's the second option. When war is a really bad idea, you do the third option, which is covert action. So all, elimination of leaders, shall we say, falls under the rubric of covert action, and it is legal under Title 50. And each president, before the church hearings in the 70s, had a program and I write about all of this in the book, documented from declassified documents. Like Eisenhower's was called, I believe, the Health Alteration Committee, literally.
Dark.
That was the assassination program. So they all have had them. And they've changed the way they're framed over the years. I mean, Obama's program using drones to kill people was called targeted killing.
Certainly self-descriptive.
So again, this is like our attitude towards what is taboo and what isn't taboo. And that other part you mentioned that's in the prologue of the book, I talk about someone coming and staying with me, an operator that I knew, and my kids being little and having G.I. Joes. I have 2 boys, and they were like obsessed with the G.I. Joes, and he showed them like how the G.I. Joes would really hold their weapons and everything. And he asked if it was okay if he showed them some real guns, and I said yes, and he set them up, and I describe it in the book. And then afterwards, there was a case that he didn't open, and I asked him what it was, and there was a knife inside of it, and I said, what is that for? Immediately realizing my naivete, or foot in mouth, and he said, sometimes a job requires quiet. And by the way, I can't tell you how many people have, in the agency have said to me, by the way, I don't even know if I believe that opening story. And I shared with at least one of them, not the name of who that person was, but by location, a few details about who that person was. And they went like, oh shit, that was that, right? So it's interesting, people's perception of what is true, what is taboo, what you're allowed to say, how you describe something, which is kind of my long-winded way of saying that I don't know that I would want to put words in Billy's mouth about what it was he thought about bad guys and about killing, because it's so much better coming from Billy himself. And he's my main source in Surprise Kill Vanish, and I quote him extensively. And I also have hours of footage with Billy talking. And I think one day it will get made into a documentary, and it's going to be great because you really just want to see him explain how his world works. I think that's the greatest gift of journalism when you're willing to do long form, as I am. Go spend time with someone, travel with someone. I traveled with Billy back to Hanoi, back to Havana, to various battlegrounds of the Cold War where he operated. I flew with him in airplanes. I sat with him in hotel rooms. I rode with him in taxi cabs, almost like reconning old places. And that's where I got the best of Billy Waugh, meaning what he thought, how he thought. He could share it with me. And then I hopefully conveyed that in the book about him. And you got the sense of who he was, which I think might be a better answer than putting words in his mouth, because it's such a taboo subject. I could never do that. I could never do that job. And yet, Billy Waugh and I related on so many human issues. I told you this before we got on air, and I'll share it here because it's just one of my favorite stories about Billy. You couldn't have two more opposite people. Our upbringings, our professions, we couldn't have been more different. And yet there was something that drew us to one another like magnets, And one time we figured out this common trait that we both had, and it made us smile, which is that Billy said to me that when he was a little kid, he just wanted to be good at school. And he used to sit in the front row, and every time the teacher asked a question, he raised his hand like that. And I laughed because I said, Billy, that's me. That's the same as me. I was that kid. Only difference is I had little braids hanging down. And I didn't go on to become the longest serving operator, euphemism, for the CIA. I became a journalist who writes about people.
As a journalist who writes about people, what did you feel when you were shown that knife and explained that that's used obviously for up-close killing?
Well, that's exactly to our point that we've been discussing. I thought about taboo. And there was a delayed reaction because in the moment I went, oh, like I could, and I write this in the book, I could envision that individual killing people with a sniper rifle. That was perfectly fine and acceptable, shall we say, to me. That's how bad guys were taken out in the war on terror. And I'm being somewhat facetious here because why? Okay, so they're still being killed, but the thought of that person sneaking up behind someone and slitting their throat or jabbing it into their ribs was shocking to me. And then I stayed up at night thinking, why is that? And I had, of course, been writing about Area 51 and this concept of, bombardment. Like looking back at because a lot of the people in Area 51, the sources, were World War II heroes. People like Colonel Slater, people like General Ledford, all of whom are in the book that I got, this opportunity to interview, not Ledford, but all the others. And I was thinking about air power, this idea that you could just carpet bomb Japan as we did, or carpet bomb Berlin as we did, indiscriminately killing people. And I was thinking about the idea that we use these 2 nuclear weapons, indiscriminately killing civilians, and what the difference was and how technology was changing and shaping and all of that. And I had been thinking about that. And, bombing people from the air at one time was taboo. And by the time World War II came, it certainly was no longer. And so I was thinking about that. And then I had that, for me, a very illuminating experience with my own self, my own preconceptions, by asking exactly those questions. Why did I think of them as different animals, if you will? And that inspired me to write Surprise, Kill, Vanish.
Okay, so realizing that you had a gap between thinking of sort of the up close and the far away as 2 different animals, was there any reconciliation for you in doing all that research and writing the book?
In a way, I want to know also how things work. But my particular brain is suited for the specifics of it. And I learn the specifics, and then maybe I say, now I think I understand more generally. And it takes a lot of information to fill in the gaps of that. And then when I began researching and reporting Surprise, Kill, Vanish, and I went back to the origin of the CIA, and I learned, okay, this all began when the CIA began in 1947. Oh, except for it didn't, because of course every origin story has an origin story. And the origin of the CIA is from the OSS, which was the organization that doesn't exist anymore, but that was the first kind of, unit that America created to kill enemies close, kill Nazis. And one of the units of the OSS were called the Jedburghs. They were the ones that jumped out of airplane into Nazi-occupied France and killed Nazis with their bare hands. Their motto was Surprise, Kill, Vanish. That was the motto of the Jedburghs. Again, taboo. And the OSS and the Jedburghs are seen as these heroic Nazi killers. Like, who cares how you kill a Nazi as long as he's dead? That's the idea. But wait, killing people in the modern day with a knife is not right. I mean, do you see? And so then, interesting. And then I just began to report the story. And for me, it's just a journey. And then one thing leads to the next. And before you know it, you're in Khartoum. Not physically, but mentally. And you're just learning. And you're trying to, if you're me, you're trying to report the story in a narrative manner that keeps it interesting and keeps it charging forward. And that isn't bringing in my own preconceptions. One of the great things about writing about things that you know almost nothing about before you start. You know the general lay of the land, but you don't know the specifics. I did not know that the CIA had a group called the President's Guerrilla Warfare Corps. That is what they were called in 1947 when they were created. They were specifically, to do the president's bidding, plausibly deniable, covert action, direct action, which means killing, in whatever manner it needs to happen. And it was set up specifically, and I quote the documents from the National Archives in the book, it was set up specifically to counter the vicious actions of Soviet Russia. Again, bringing us back to our big concept here, which is that if you believe your enemy is vicious and wants to kill you, you're going to create programs that mirror theirs. Monkey see, monkey do. If you can move toward, as I would hope society is, move toward this idea of, okay, some men are really aggressive. And then when I say men, I mean men and women, right? But we don't all have to be, and we can actually evolve. We can train our own thinking. You can train your brain to see optimistically as opposed to being suspicious. You can. I know that for a personal fact. Go take a hike and watch what happens.
It's interesting. I was just going to say that in listening to all that, I think I understand the way you like to be approached, which is as a deep journalist, somebody who's just reporting the facts, that I think only about synthesizing things, putting them together. What do they mean? What does this mean? How is it useful? You want to present the facts, devoid of your read of the situation, devoid of any moral compass or judgment. This simply is what is. But then when you were saying that you can train yourself how to think, that tells me that there's more to it. But in an interview, I have a feeling that if I pursued that leg, okay, give me other things that you can train yourself to do or whatever, that you'll end up pulling back. All right, so let's talk conspiracies through the lens of a journalist, because I think of UFOs, CIA, they are part of a larger sense of control of focus, control of information via disinformation, quite frankly. That seems like the most likely thing. Now, I don't go very deep into these things, so people may know it better and think that that's a totally off read, and fair enough. But what are the conspiracies? My word, you may not even like that word, but things that the general public will think of as a conspiracy, whether it's Area 51, whether it's JFK, whatever. What are the ones that you have spent the most time with that you're like, I understand the facts of this situation?
Conspiracies come up in all of my work. I mean, when I began writing Area 51, conspiracies were sort of pushed over to like a very small group of individuals, I think. That was back in 2009. Certainly, the number of people interested in these kinds of things that I write about has grown exponentially. Why, I don't know, but that just is what it is. But I drill down on all these different conspiracies, trying to demonstrate that no wonder there's conspiracies. I guess that would be the takeaway. Maybe the best. So, well, I can't tell you which one I've spent the most time on because they just appear and reappear. I can certainly tell you two interesting things to be true. Is one, almost all military programs have a thread back to the Nazi scientists.
Why?
Well, why were the Germans the smartest people in the world? Like, okay, just as a sort of, if you look at the amount of Nobel Prizes they won in science, why were they so darn smart? And then why did they become Nazis as a society? I can't answer that. I cannot answer that. I've read a million books on the theories, but still, there is no answer yet. It doesn't make any sense to me. I can understand why lack of education, why religious zealotry leads toward insanity and cruelty. I can understand that part, but I can't understand how the educated mind goes there. That's the conundrum of the Nazis to me. But so most of the weapons technology loops back there because we, the United States, suddenly in pole position after World War II, wanting to stay in pole position, wanting to stay at the front, knowing that the Soviet Union's, the Soviet communist ideals were absolutely counter to democracy, and we could not be allies with them anymore. Like immediately, not even when the war ended, but as the war was ending. And it just, such it was that the weapon systems became incredibly important, developing them to be able to beat the Russians. So many things loop back to the Nazis, which is problematic because the Nazis are like the biggest locus of conspiracies. That's just a fact. And then, but on the specifics of why do I spend time on them and what do I spend time on, I think it's because it's interesting that there's always a thread of truth. So I say to myself, well, no wonder people think this is a conspiracy, or think, and I'll give you an alternate, I'll give you one specific example about the moon landing, right? So, and I try to interview people from both sides of the aisle. So when I interviewed Buzz Aldrin, second man on the moon, right, who went to the moon, if you're on that side of things,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
If you're on that side. Did he punch you for even bringing it up?
Oh, no. And, but then I look at these photographs that I have in one of my books, a couple of my books, of astronauts training to what it would be like to walk on the moon, to stumble around on the moon. And they're inside atomic craters. So craters left behind of atomic weapons we exploded in the 1950s. And you see these astronauts with mock-ups of their backpacks, walking around in them, and you see them close up, and if you look at it close up, it looks like they're on the moon, and then you pull back, and you realize, they're in a crater on Earth. And so no wonder there are these different conspiracy theories. Now, what really gets interesting, and more interesting to me in terms of like Hollywood and science fiction, is why that is. Why is it that those ideas are fostered? Is that human nature? Is it just in the zeitgeist, people talking about it and then more people talking about it and more people questioning? Or is it in someone's interest to generate more ideas along those lines? And if so, who is that? Who is that someone? For me, that's why I enjoy watching Hollywood movies.
Just for the speculation? But having seen so many of these things up close, you don't have a sense of like, oh, I've seen this kind of playbook before. While I don't know the specifics, it's going to be something like this.
I certainly feel that way with UFOs. And keep in mind that I am friendly with many of the country's leading ufologists. And when I say friendly, meaning I can sit next to them at a dinner party and I can call them up and have a conversation. Some of them send me their papers. Oh, Annie, this is a really interesting paper. We now think that actually there are, UAPs under the ocean. Read this and tell me what you think. I can read that. And they all know that I'm on the other side of the aisle with, I don't believe there are aliens among us, which doesn't mean I'm not going to be pleasantly surprised if I'm wrong. What an interesting thing. But right now, that's not the position that I take.
Because when you look at the evidence, you see what?
I see Paul Benowitz.
The guy who the CIA broke mentally.
I see strategic deception campaigns, and I also see way too much inside baseball. If you were to whiteboard out the players of the ufologists, that whole thrust, it's the same people over and over again. And the new players seem to be, to me, the Paul Benowitzes, the people being used to further that idea. I mean, I've had so many people that are in the center of all this contact me that I have ongoing conversations with, by the way, just out of intellectual curiosity, out of interest in human nature. A lot of them we're having conversation where I'm like, I'm not writing about this, just so that you know, because I have other things I want to report on. But I love having this conversation because it's super interesting. People who tell me all different kinds of things about this world. And I know I'm sounding cryptic here, so forgive me, but the bottom line takeaway for me is it's so much more interesting and in many ways lighter than talking or thinking about war and weapons. So far, as far as I know, no aliens, these supposed aliens haven't killed anyone. war and weapons do a lot of damage. It's hard to think about. It's easier to think about something that is incredibly fanciful and probably, in my mind, lives much more along the axis of Jung's thinking, Carl Jung's thinking. I think of UAPs and UFOs as man's desire to make sense of his world.
Where do you think things get back to the truth? So if when you look at UFOs, you see strategic deception, what do you think when you look at something like JFK? You've got RFK, who's saying, I'm telling you right now, the CIA killed I think he says both, his uncle and his father, but certainly his uncle. Do you go strategic deception, they're dragging this out to keep people guessing, but really this is going to end up being innocuous? Or do you go, yeah, that actually makes sense?
That might fall into the just don't make me do it category. Like, I think it's RFK Jr.'s opinions about that are very interesting. That's his father and his uncle. That's very interesting to me. I don't put a judgment on that. It's really
Not
more
the judgment. I'm more trying to get at the facts. So
yeah. So I have no reason to think that's true. Again, that's the kind of like the UAP
why do you
part
think
of it.
they don't reveal like so many years
Of course,
later?
that's crazy. Of course, it is totally crazy. But my feeling is, and I'm going to tell you an interesting story about JFK in a minute. My feeling is that, and this is pure speculation, is that whatever the answer is, and my eye goes toward Cuba, I mean, killing a United States president, whoever did it, there's going to be some payback involved. Let's just say the facts came out, and it was a nation state. There would be payback involved. How could there not be? How could a president reveal that and not be asked to? And now you have, let's point right there at that book, Nuclear War. That would be my speculation. But here, you want an interesting anecdote about the JFK?
Always.
Okay. So Dr. Bud Whelan was incredibly interesting for me to interview. The mayor of Area 51, that was his terminology for himself. The first director of the Directorate of Science and Technology at CIA. Incredibly brilliant person. Didn't give interviews to a lot of people, had given some, but definitely had not spoken about Area 51 before. He agreed to talk to me because I was interviewing a number of the A-12 Oxcart pilots who said, you got to talk to Annie. So he let me come up to his ranch in Santa Barbara and interview him for a number of hours. The minder in between us, because there's always kind of a liaison between you and someone in the agency, not always, but often, and certainly at his level, said to me, by the way, you may not ask any questions about JFK.
Interesting.
So, of course, I'm like, what do you mean? Like, I mean, but I was reporting Area 51. I really wanted him to talk to me on the record about Area 51. My answer was, of course. I didn't ask, but it was in the back of my mind. It was in the back of my mind. Never asked. Whelan said a really interesting thing to me at the conclusion of our interviews. He was so patient with me. I mean, even had the drawing papers out. He was explaining to me how missile technology worked. He was just, like so many of those people, was so incredibly gifted, such a consummate professional. Remember, he built the first satellite program called Corona for the United States. Like, he was a bunch of firsts. I thank him in the end of the book here and list some of the things he did. And he said to me when the interview was closing, okay, so by the way, until your book publishes, whatever you need, fact-checking, you want to double-check a quote, you want photographs, whatever you want, I'm happy to oblige. But the day your book publishes, we will never speak again. Which is such a CIA interesting sort of like, wow, that's like, must be some kind of code. And it just was, it sticks with me because it was so it was such a shocking thing to say, and it was so interesting. And sure enough, no contact from Dr. Bud Whelan. Flash forward maybe 1 or 2 or 3 years later. I'm in my house, and I say to my husband, honey, have you seen my cell phone? Like, where is it? It's usually, in my back pocket or something. And he said, oh, yeah, it rang. It's right over there. And I pick it up, and it says missed call, Dr. Bud Whelan. He called me. I said, Kevin, oh my God, what? He's going to tell me about JFK. That's all I could think of, right? And I said, what do I do? And Kevin said, call him back. And I was like, I'm nervous. He said, no, just call him back. He called just a few minutes ago. So I stepped out onto the balcony. And I'll just never forget that moment because I'm like looking out over downtown Los Angeles from my balcony going, I'm about to learn the secret of JFK's assassination. He's having like a near deathbed, moment. He's decided to tell someone, and it's me. I hit redial. A woman answers the phone, young. I mumble my name. This is Amy. She goes, yes, Annie. And I said, Dr. Whelan just called me and I'm returning his call. And she said, no, he didn't. And hung up.
Whoa.
And that was it.
Whoa.
And he died just a few weeks later.
Really? Give me the chills.
And my husband said to me, you were not supposed to know who killed JFK.
I'm so crestfallen you didn't answer that call when it came in.
But
Annie.
I mustn't have been. Okay, so here's another one, really.
Yeah.
And my husband is right, because there is a story about Whelan that I did ask him, because of course when I learned back up when I learned like don't ask him, you cannot ask him about JFK. Of course I had to like Google, or rather read in books like what does he know? And what I learned was that when JFK was assassinated, Alan Dulles took the 5 top directors of the different directorates at CIA down into the basement for several hours immediately after JFK was assassinated. And the story goes that they all came up white-faced. So that whatever really happened, those 5 people were told. That's one story. And another story I learned from asking around different agency people, I can't ask him about JFK, but why do you think that is? And another one told me a story. They said, Whelan in the 70s, I think it was, had a private plane that he used to fly around in a lot. And one day he lent his plane to his neighbor, and the plane blew up.
Whoa.
And I asked him that during our interviews. I said, why do you think that plane blew up? And he said, you shouldn't lend your plane to your neighbor.
And that's it.
No follow-up question there. Because the follow-up question would have been, was it linked to JFK? So, we're talking about all of this with levity, but it's a very serious issue. That's the only reason why I can think that those records are still classified, is because it's too dangerous. And I would think that has to do with a nation state. I mean, I have interviewed literally hundreds of people that have worked for the CIA, and none of them ever have given me an indication that it was that the CIA assassinated JFK. That's certainly what Robert F. Kennedy makes public, that he thinks. But, what do I know? And the real question is what does he know?
Yeah, very good question. What, if you were going to point yourself or the public at asking the right series of questions to get to that answer, how would you approach that problem? Like when you encounter a conspiracy, and let's use JFK as the example, but when you encounter a conspiracy, how do you work your way through so that you don't fall for disinformation or something fake?
I don't know that I would ever dare to try to solve a mystery that's so powerful and impactful, because I think it would be like waiting for Godot.
What does that mean?
Well, like you would just be writing for a really long time without getting an answer. I mean, the best answer I can say to that is my friend and colleague Tom O'Neill, who wrote a book called Chaos. Do you know about Chaos? The Secret History of the 60s? The CIA and the Secret History of the 60s.
I've seen it on Audible,
Oh my
but
God!
never listened to it.
It's one of my favorite books. Tom's one of my favorite people, and Tom is the example of why that wouldn't work for me. And Tom and I always joke because he took 25 years to write his book, and I write a book every 2 years.
Whoa.
So Tom got an assignment in the late 90s to report on the, whatever it was, 30th anniversary of the Manson murders. And he finished it. He immediately started reporting on it and was like, oh my God, this is going to be a book. And he finished the book, a couple years ago. And it published, and it's been an incredible bestseller ever since. It's one of the most incredible books I've ever read. Does Tom come to a finite conclusion about who killed the Mansons? I mean, of course we know who killed the Mansons, but I don't want to give the spoiler alert. Actually, should I?
I'd love to hear it, yeah.
Because if you have Tom on the show, which you should, and I'm sure many of the readers know because the book's been out for a bunch of years now, but Tom posits that Charles Manson was a CIA asset.
Whoa.
And when there's a point in the book where he asks one of his sources, oh my God, do you mean Charles Manson was a CIA experiment gone wrong? They said, no, he was a CIA experiment gone right. And remember, this was in the time when the CIA was actively trying to create people who they could manipulate into killing other people. We know that. That is a fact.
Why would they kill a Hollywood star?
You got to read Tom's book. You got to read Tom's book. But the point of all that is Tom isn't able to actually produce a document. He's very careful about saying that he is suggesting. But he demonstrates in exquisite detail over a 25-year reporting period with incredible sources why he believes this to be true. That's the kind of JFK book I would really be interested in reading.
So, but what is that process? What do those questions look like? What I want to understand, because I've written this question down on my pad like 3 times now. What I'm trying to figure out is where you're giving so many examples of things where it's like, yeah, the government probably really did that. Yeah, the government probably really did that. And so I'm just like, I now just go, I am always going to look at sideways, question it. I'm not just going to take it at face value. But somewhere you re-engage with truth and just assume that, oh, this is real until proven otherwise. How do you find that line? So when you're asking questions, how do you vet the answers? How do you know what the next question is to ask? Like, what is that mental process?
Well, I'm not trying to solve the JFK murder. So like with Bilyeu, I'm just simply trying to find out, you get the idea to write a book about the CIA's paramilitary when you see your colleague, someone you know, with a gun and a knife, and you go, wait a minute, what? And then you suddenly realize there's a huge gap there and I need to fill it. And then you just learn everything you can and work with as many sources and tell the story, and the story unfolds in that manner. And you go through history. That's how my books are.
So you are effectively, I'm trying to lay out a narrative.
Yep.
I'm asking a bunch of questions that are trying to fill out that narrative. I find where the gaps are. And I'm going to, because you've talked about, I was reading a Pentagon budget report and they made a reference to this thing, and I've read enough of these documents to know that thing connects to this thing. And now I have more dots on the narrative that I'm trying to lay out.
Yeah.
So I assume then if you were approaching, whether it's UFOs, JFK, whatever, you're going to say, okay, let's get a timeline, or let's tell a narrative that makes sense from motive through to completion. And I'm going to connect all these dots and probably find things in obscure places. What do you do when you run into an unreliable narrator where you're like, you just told me a thing. I'm not so sure that thing is true. So for instance, take you call it the last 12 pages. It was an audiobook for me, so I don't know. But the last 12 pages of Area 51 is the whole thing that this was Stalin. The little aliens that people saw really were alive. They really were humans who had been surgically altered to look like they had big heads, gigantic eyes. And the reason that you believe that is you believe the person that told you that he was a part of it. So walk us through how you go about assessing whether this guy's for real or not.
I did a podcast with Lex Friedman a month ago, a long podcast like this one, where I told Lex the name of the source for the first time in 12 years. And the source's name is Al O'Donnell. And the reason I told Lex that was because it made sense within the context of what Lex and I were talking about. And it certainly makes sense in the context of what you're asking me here, which is how do you trust someone? So that source, Al O'Donnell, is also someone I thank in nuclear war scenario. Al O'Donnell was also known as the trigger man. So I actually write about Al O'Donnell in Area 51. If you go into the back of the book in the index and you look up Al O'Donnell, you can see where he's written about. He just also happens to be the source for the story of Area 51 and the so-called aliens. That part of the story, we keep him anonymous. But he's the same person. And so how do you trust someone like that? Well, he wired, armed, and fired 186 nuclear weapons for the government. If you don't trust someone like that, you have to really ask yourself, wow, so the government trusted this guy to arm, wire, and fire all these nuclear weapons as a member of the arming party. They sent him to the Marshall Islands repeatedly. And he had a Q clearance and a top secret clearance. He's got awards all over his wall. He's got a wing in the museum, the Atomic Testing Museum, named after him. This guy's credible in the technical, canonical sense of the word, credible. He's not living in a trailer drinking beer and shooting squirrels and taking drugs. So then you have to say, what is this information and how does it fit into the context of the story I'm telling? And am I going to include it? Because people tell me all kinds of things. And it may not, that's the privilege of the journalist, where you make the distinction of whether or not you want to include something. So does that answer your question about how you trust someone?
I have follow-ups. So the obvious question to ask is, given everything you yourself have encountered where somebody is being used for disinformation, while I'm not close enough to this problem to know how you would or wouldn't be useful, but it is certainly possible that he realized you could help disseminate a lie, that you could throw people off the scent. Here's a very credible journalist, and I'm going to give her a piece of information from a very credible source. And especially, I don't know if he asked you to keep him anonymous at first, but certainly that is a plausible thing that could have happened. So do you go off gut instinct that just doesn't feel right, or do you have something that you use as a barometer to weigh whether you think you're being part of the manipulation?
It's a long process, because if you put someone on the spot, of course, that might be we're done here. Al O'Donnell I interviewed for 100 or more hours. What's important to keep in mind if you reread the 12 pages in the end is that in addition to telling the story of what he believed happened at Roswell, because he was not there, he also tells the story of the government creating a program that simulated what was believed to be the Russian program of creating child-size aviators to look like aliens.
Was he involved in that?
He was involved in that, according to him. So then you have to ask yourself, I'm following your logic here, wait a minute, you were involved in this? So now he's implicating himself in a program in which people were murdered. That's a big leap for a person with a long history, a credible history, a reputation, a legacy to, in essence, rip apart. And he absolutely agreed that I could tell his name when I felt it was appropriate. So there's that piece of the puzzle. Then there's also the fact that after the book published, it was obvious to his family it was him. Of course they knew it was him. And I was asked to come out to his home. And I arrived at his home and his entire family was sitting in the living room. And we had like a come to Jesus discussion. That's a metaphor. Because they were devastated. They were devastated. And his wife of 60 years, in essence, like begged him, like, tell us this is not true. To your point. To which he said it is true. And so that is remarkable in my mind, because what he said to me, and as I write in the book, the reason that he revealed that information was he wanted to make the point that he was a dedicated patriot. He dedicated his life to the American way of life, to working in the military-industrial complex, to wiring, arming, and firing nuclear bombs. He believed in democracy. He believed in defense. He fought in World War II. He fought at the Battle of Okinawa. What he did in that little instance of a program he was ashamed of, and he wished he had never done it. It had been authorized by the government, whoever the government may have been. And the reason he shared it, according to him, was as a cautionary tale, to let people know that be careful what you're willing to do in the name of government, even if you're told it's for the safety and security of the nation. That is what he wanted known. And his family knew that. And his family had to accept that.
What was your role in the family conversation? Who was it that wanted you there specifically?
That's a good question. As I remember, I have to go back and look at my notes. I think it was him and also his wife. You know, I had spent hours with Ruth, his wife. You know, a very interesting thing happened. I stayed in contact with him for a long time. We would always go have Chinese food and talk about things. And then one day I got a call from his minder that said, you need to stop talking to him.
Whoa.
And I knew enough from people I work with in the agency that if you ever get a call like that, I mean, I have children. And I just accepted that, and I never called him again. And then I got a call when he died, the morning he died. And it was the same minder. And they said, he died, and he wanted you to know. And I said, wow, thank you so much for calling me and telling me. That's like so kind of you. And they said, don't thank us, thank him. It was on his list. He had 10 people he wanted notified, and you were number 2. And I wanted to say, I think I did say, who was number 1? Maybe I didn't say that. I was shocked, you know. And then I said, may I come to the funeral? And they said, absolutely not.
Why not?
These are the mysteries of the intelligence community. These are the mysteries of the Atomic Energy Commission, now called the Department of Energy. These are the mysteries of some of the dark and dirty secrets. So there is no doubt that Al O'Donnell was the keeper of a dark and dirty government secret. What it is, we don't know. Toward the end of his life, you know, he and I talked about this, which is why I imagine they put the kibosh on it. Who was listening, how was listening, I have no idea, it doesn't matter. But I wanted to know what he thought, because of course there were 2 theories, even though his identity was not known, although it was known to a very few select group of people. You know, one idea was that he was fed misinformation. So even though he believed what he was told, it may have been misinformation. But he still did what he did, and he always stood by that to the end. This reverse engineering program that's so dark that you have to read if you want the details of. But, you know, we talked about whether or not he had been misled. And we had long, thoughtful conversations about it, kind of like you and I are having, but without lights, camera, action, just 2 people talking. We'd go have Chinese food and wonder about these things. And then the conversation would shift to other things. And I knew a lot about him. I know his whole life. And so we were friends. Why he chose to tell me that story is a great mystery. What exactly the truth is about all of that is a great mystery. And I certainly hope that someone is able to report further on that.
What do you think the handlers would have done if you had not backed off?
Don't know, don't need to know, because I backed off.
You said, though, I have kids.
Again, this is where you can really go conspiratorial thinking, but one of his children wound up in a wheelchair.
Say more.
That's all I'm going to say.
Man, I jumped to conclusions on that one.
That's all I'm going to say.
Okay. Very intriguing, to be sure. Let's go back to what started these 12 pages. So if all of that is true, and Stalin had... So, in fact, before we get into Stalin, what is the punchline of Area 51? Why is it called Area 51? What does it have to do with aliens, exactly?
Area 51 is a secret base in Nevada where, the CIA, the Air Force, and other government agencies have been working on military and intelligence programs across the Cold War. Many of them have to do with aerial reconnaissance, this idea that was developed out of, in the early days of the Cold War, that we would spy on Soviet Russia, that we wanted to know what was going on inside that enigmatic nation. Remember the Churchill quote, Russia is an enigma wrapped inside a puzzle, right?
Yeah.
We didn't know. We didn't know what was going on in there. We didn't know how it worked. In many ways, we're back to that same position today. What is Russia thinking? What are the Russians thinking? Why are they acting the way they do? We don't know, but we built the U-2 spy plane to try and take photographs of the military installations in Soviet Russia so that we could see specifically if they were lining up for war. I had the great privilege of interviewing Hervey Stockman, the first man to fly over the Soviet Union in a U-2. He took those photographs, click, 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 came home with wet film. The CIA developed that film and learned more about the Soviet Union than we had known, and learned they were not lining up for war. Everything at Area 51 in the beginning was designed for reconnaissance, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. This idea that we didn't want to have nuclear war with the Soviets, but we had to know what they were doing. And then things have progressed through the years. There's no doubt Area 51 continues to be a great mystery. Most of my reporting in that book is from the 50s, 60s, and 70s because that was declassified. What's going on there now? I can't wait to find out. It always keeps coming up. In my Surprise Kill Vanish book, I learned from CIA operators that a bunch of Iraqi special forces, were flown to Area 51, and a really dark unit, I'm going to call them. They were called the Scorpions. I mean, they did some dark and dirty stuff back in Iraq. Where were they trained? Out at Area 51. So it's a massive base, inside of a massive base, inside of the Nevada Test and Training Range.
One of the things you said in the book was that Stalin was upset that they didn't have nuclear capabilities, so the U.S. had beaten them on that, and that if the whatever crashed in Roswell actually was an advanced form of propulsion, that he wanted to show, I've got this thing that you guys don't have, and that there was a tie to his thinking that, given what he had seen with War of the Worlds, that a radio program caused people to freak out because they thought there was actually an alien invasion. He was trying to drop something in to say, look, I have this better technology, and I'm going to cause your populace to go bananas. What do you think he was after? Was it really just that, an FU and I'm going to try to cause a scare? Or, I mean, that just seems so extreme.
There's two concepts you're bringing up. One is strategic deception. One is this idea of hysteria, of making people, overwhelming people with the obsession about something. UFOs, we could say, in 2024, certainly if the seeds were laid then, the seeds have grown. People are obsessed with UFOs to a manner that boggles my mind, because I would say mostly there's nothing there. I mean, you keep hearing this repetition of the Tic Tac and the this and this guy, and I mean, it's just the same names ad nauseum. Congress is doing an investigation. It's not a whole lot, as far as I'm concerned. So Stalin's idea is clearly a wise idea. Keep the people hysterical, keep them interested. But another situation that was in play is this idea of doesn't exist in the same manner, but in the late 1940s and 1950s, we didn't have ICBMs. If nuclear war would have happened, it would have happened with aircraft. And so this idea very specifically was to overwhelm the U.S. airwaves. You have everybody in the world making phone calls like they did during the War of the Worlds radio broadcast when Orson Welles delivered it. The radio, the telephone lines go down, and it allows the bombers to do a sneak attack. Sneak attack has changed over the decades with science and technology, but it's always there, a sneak attack. I begin the nuclear war scenario with a bolt out of the blue attack, which is what I was told everyone in Russia fears most. That's a sneak attack. The difference is America, the military-industrial complex, has spent trillions of dollars putting a system into space so that the sneak attack is detected in the first second. It's still a sneak attack. There's nothing anyone can do about it. That's what makes nuclear weapons different from all weapon systems. The reason why you wanted to do a sneak attack is because if someone knows it's coming, they can do something. Nuclear weapons defy all of that because you can't do anything. You can't shoot a nuclear weapon down, almost assuredly, and you can't redirect it. And so all of these things, all of my reporting, does entwine in an interesting narrative way, certainly interesting to me, and definitely supports the ride the horse in the direction it's going. Because remember, each one of these ideas has come to me after the other book finishes. I go, another little seed is left, planted. And I say, that's really interesting. I want to follow that thread. And the thread takes us both forward and also always ties back to World War II in my reporting.
Is there a fundamental reason that you want to tie things back to World War II, or do you see this just, it is still this big echo out of World War II?
The latter, because I write about war and weapons and national security and secrets, and it all began in World War II with America's science and technology program suddenly being funded by the U.S. military. And that is the key. There is so much money there, taxpayer monies. And so this is a very interesting idea that we've been talking about all day, which is that Congress does what the people are interested in. So the people really do have the power, as much as that sounds like a cliche. The people have the power to put pressure on X, Y, or Z of interest. The only real point, I suppose, is the takeaway of our conversation that I think I have made, which is important, is if you divide the people and they can't agree on anything, they're certainly not going to be pushing in the right direction of a certain kind of change, which is away from the military-industrial complex setting the agenda for everyone. And I believe that some pushback on that is a great thing.
Yeah, that to me is what I felt reading your work. That is the thing that the more I go down the rabbit hole of how does the world really work, I keep running into, it's not a perfect manipulation machine. It's super messy. I don't want people to think, I don't even think there's like some evil cabal behind the scenes, but I think that there are enough little pockets of hyper self-interested groups that have managed to find ways to confuse the public in a way that allows them to have their little fiefdoms, and you get enough of these little fiefdoms and things derange. And so Yeah, I mean, this has become such a cliche, but late stage empire vibes. And I just have a feeling that you get enough of these little things and they're like little cancer cells and they just spread, and each one of them is just looking out for itself, and not in some horrendous way, but the military starts with the good intentions of wanting to protect the nation, but then it becomes the military industrial complex, and then it becomes a lot of people with a lot of bonuses that benefit from war, and then it becomes, well, we can actually steer people's thinking a little bit, and now all of a sudden you have social media, and it's like, oh wow, well, if we can make these, if we can control what gets published, then we can really influence what people care about. And since I, as the government, only have to care about what the people care about, if I can control what they care about, now, wait a second, like I can really make things better for myself. And I'll even grant them, let's just say that they really want good things for people. But it's like, well, they're all sheep and they need to be guided, and we can't just let them hear any truth. Like, that's crazy. And so I think part of the reason that COVID changed things for so many people, myself included, is I remember when the mask mandate came out, and I said to my wife, I'm like, that doesn't make sense. Either masks work or they don't. And because the first thing they said was, no, they don't work, so save them for medical professionals. And I was like, what? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Either they work or they don't work. That doesn't, like, this is just a non-compute. And so seeing, though, how people would do what they were told because they were afraid. And I was like, ooh, this is very unnerving. If you can keep people afraid, if you can keep them confused, you can really get them to agree to things that may not be in their best interest. And it is very interesting because I see that thread through your work, which is there, and maybe I'm making it more sort of like this all-encompassing thing that just eats the universe, and you keep it in a much more confined way. But when I look at it, I just see in each book, there's this element of we're going to control things. So take, surprise, kill, vanish. It's all clandestine. We don't talk about that. We create Title 50 to make sure that we can do it and that it's legal and all is well. We codename things in a way that doesn't sound bad. And so we just begin siphoning things off. Area 51, it's like if it really was because if I remember correctly from your book, it becomes called Area 51 because the crash in Roswell in 47 gets moved there in 51. And so it's like, well, but that was Stalin trying to mess with us. We stopped him. Horrible experiments being done, but we kind of take a lesson and go, whoa, like maybe we could do something similar. We start our own horrendous experiment. But it's like, oh, people think it is aliens. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, and let's let them run with that. And maybe we leak a little bit here and there to get people focused on that thing, because the reality is that if this was hey guys, know that the nuclear thing is going to play out with airships, and we have better technology than you, and this is a way for us to go back and forth, and we don't want people to know that. You just start to go, okay, wait a second. This isn't about transparency. This is about control of focus, control of information, clandestine wars. Obviously, as we go into the Cold War, really trying to do it all underground, behind the scenes. And now, since I'm trying to go, okay, I'm living in a moment. How do I navigate this moment well? I know that we don't have a peer competitor in Russia. Russia's not where we're at. China, though, is a peer competitor. And so now, are we running the same playbook? Can I believe the information that I hear about what's going on in their economy? Maybe I can, maybe I can't. What's going to play out between them and Taiwan? How do I position myself to be in a good position? Is the U.S. government collecting all this data on us? They're telling me I need to be worried about China, but is this owning TikTok? Is it really a problem that China owns TikTok? Is this a play to weaken Elon Musk's hold on the one social media that sits outside of this? And so as I go through all of these things, I'm not saying I know any of these to be true. I'm just saying what I am learning through all of this is that not only do I need to encounter the facts, which you do a phenomenal job of putting on the table, but to your point earlier, to Dwight Eisenhower's point, you have to make up your own mind. You have to synthesize this information, and you have to come up with a coherent, constrained narrative, because when people spin out of control and everything's a conspiracy and there is no truth and it's all this grand lie, I think they will end up missing what is probably more true, which is, oh, there's clumsiness, there's messiness in all of this, there's some stupidity, there's some moments of brilliance, there's manipulation that works, there's manipulation that fails. I mean, SR-71 was kept a secret for 20 years and 10,000 people knew about it, I think is a stat I heard directly from you. So, I mean, it's a little bit of, yeah, sometimes you really are being tricked and duped and bamboozled, and other times it's just clumsy awkwardness, and you have to be an informed, alert citizenry.
I think you said that really well. And then the takeaway is, with the exception of COVID, just don't make me do it, right? Because then you can really say, this is what I want to focus on. I want to be alert and knowledgeable, and now I'm also going to clear my head and go on a hike. Because I think living your life with a certain optimism and a positive attitude toward the future, mindful of, wow, there's a lot to digest here, is a balance, because you would completely become overwhelmed. So
what has researching nuclear war, CIA assassinations, aliens, Hitler, unexplained phenomena, what has all of that taught you about how the world really works?
I appreciate pulling back the veil and exploring what might really be there. I also think what's very important in the common denominator takeaway is that people are a lot smarter and a lot more curious than maybe they generally give themselves credit for. And my books tend to make people feel like, oh, I understand something I didn't understand before.
What is that thing?
Government and government secrecy is such a powerful player in all of our lives in 2024. And if you go back in time, when I began reporting on these issues, sort of in the early days of the war on terror, I think people's perception was very different. It's a combination of maybe technology and general sort of mayhem and chaos in the world that has left people more curious. And I know that's a very big generalization, but shall I give you an example?
Yeah, please.
Right? Because I write about very complex science and technology programs within the government and the CIA. And I strive to make them understandable to regular people. I come from old school journalism, whereby the people that you write for simply need a high school education. There isn't sort of a highfalutin sense of like, we understand more than you do. It's just more like, here's the facts, ma'am. I had someone, I get quite a bit of fan mail, and I had one individual write to me a couple years back, but I still like to share this story because it sums up, I think, the kind of work I do, maybe the underlying. So the person who wrote to me was a truck driver, a long-haul truck driver, and he said, and I'm paraphrasing him, but he said, all my life, people tried to tell me I'm stupid. I've listened to all your books on audio, obviously driving his truck. And he said, now I know I'm actually quite smart. And I think that probably sums up the fundamental underpinnings of all of my work.
Whoa, okay. I hope people hear that. That is one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, what is the point of mis and disinformation? Why does the government go so hard to confuse us? What advantage is it to keep the populace confused?
I might disagree that it's a big, giant government strategy to do that. I would take more personal responsibility. So in other words, yes, case by case, I can by all means take you through multiple programs that involve what is called strategic deception by the CIA. But that is only a tiny portion of the national security apparatus at work. I mean, and the Defense Department is doing war fighting, and the CIA is doing intelligence gathering, and things have gotten very confused and complicated in the war on terror, and I've written about this in multiple books. But to your question about why is the government trying to confuse us, I would say, I would go back at you with a different question, which is, why are people that are fundamentally curious so quick to think someone's doing something to them when perhaps they might actually have a part in that and might be doing it to themselves? And usually that has to do with, now here's where I get very biased, not reading. Because I believe if you read, and I'm talking about reading a bunch of different things, reading, if you're reading short form, if you're reading newspapers, you should read everybody's, and I don't mean to say opinion, you should read news reports from opposing organizations, and then make your own decisions about what you think is significant to you.
Have you seen the meme of, it's the curve? So low IQ people, the government's manipulating us. Mid-curve people, come on, bro, it's not this vast conspiracy. They'd never be able to keep this stuff secret. And then high IQ people, the government's manipulating us.
I have not seen that meme, and I don't agree with it.
Tell me more.
I don't agree with it because I think, well, first of all, I think we're all a lot smarter than, I don't really believe in channels of intelligence. I think that there's people who enjoy using their brains, and therefore they become more informed. If you like learning about things, you're going to naturally become, in what air quotes is smarter, right? You're naturally going to become more informed. But I believe also that you want to have that open mind, open channel to be able to think about alternate ideas about what you're thinking about. Otherwise, you're just gathering information to prove something that you want to believe is true. So if you want to believe the government is a big, giant conspiracy factory, by all means, there's information out there. I mean, I'm fascinated. Of course, I read what people believe about my books, particularly the CIA. And there's always, people who take things away from my books that are diametrically opposed. So it's up to
Meaning
you.
some people are like, the government really is a conspiracy factory, and other people are like, thank you so much for exposing. This is really more mundane and just sort of day-to-day business.
I'll give you an example. At almost all of my book signings, including the one for nuclear war, someone there tells me that they have a chip in their brain that has been implanted there by DARPA. Okay? So I have written about DARPA's brain implant programs. Does that mean, and then you can do the ... right? So one group of people might take away from that idea and say, wow, this is really dangerous that DARPA's working on these kind of programs that could really get out of control. Because that's certainly the lane of thinking that I pursue in the DARPA book based on interviews with people like the Jason scientists. And then another group of people could say, that believe they have a chip in their brain that has been implanted by DARPA, that would say, Annie's book demonstrates that, in fact, I have a chip in my brain. Now, those are wildly divergent examples, but I think that's what it kind of speaks to, the generalization that can happen about my work.
Okay, that seems fair. However, as a student of your work, you cite many, many times where the government is clearly manipulating people. I have it in my notes. I'm not able to find it super fast, but there was a guy that the CIA knew had seen some classified airplanes flying, and so they literally sent him to an insane asylum because they just gaslit him so hard that it ended up breaking him psychically. We've got the whole thing that you wrote at the end of Area 51, where the hypothesis that you put forward is that the aliens that crashed in Roswell were actually humans that were surgically modified by Joseph Stalin. and that the U.S. was doing a similar program. I can assure you that the government is manipulating the money supply. That is for sure, and that has a tremendous impact on us. You've also talked about that you think that it's possible that they're downplaying some of the impact of the difference between the atomic bomb and thermonuclear weapons because they just really don't want you thinking about it. So it's one of those where it really does seem like there is a ton of evidence for that. And so what I want to understand is you're a very careful journalist who is certainly right now being very thoughtful about, look, if you're looking for conspiracy, you're going to find it. But it's maybe not the right conclusion to draw. So help me understand, in the face of all the stuff that is real, why would you still want people to break to the other side of just get informed and you're going to be fine?
Well, I think it has to do with, I mean, I'm looking at the word impact theory, right? What impacts you directly? So break it down specifically. The first situation you're talking about is a guy called Paul Benowitz. And I use him as an example when people ask me, do you believe there are aliens among us? And I use, because it's not a discussion that I want to really spend a lot of time having for a number of reasons. I think there are a lot more significantly powerful things to be discussing right now than aliens among us. And by the way, there are so many people that will have that conversation for hours. So I use Benowitz as an example because he exists on the public record as someone who in the late 1970s believed he saw UFOs, was targeted by the Air Force intelligence to become an influence operation for purposes we really don't know why, but there's no doubt that he was targeted. And they didn't put him in a mental institution. He went bonkers, which happens to a lot of people who cannot get out of a thinking loop, and when there are outside forces encouraging them to think about things that are, simply put, bananas. And so, I think he's interesting in that regard. I think that aliens in general are really not that interesting to me. When I think about, going back to the word impact, what is really impacting your life?
Okay, that is certainly followable logic. However, I will ask, I'm not a conspiracy guy. I spend almost no time thinking about conspiracy theories, but I think a lot about what Dwight Eisenhower said as he left office. So at first it was, hey, beware of the military-industrial complex, but he was also like, you need to be an informed and alert citizenry, and that's what keeps the government in check. As we've moved into the age of the internet and social media, I see a problem that has arisen that I think is being wielded against us by companies to make more money and by governments to keep us confused, and I think that the confusion is strategic. So with velocity and volume of information, you can keep people confused enough that you can direct their attention. And so taking that, the aliens thing, so I've talked to privately, so I'll hedge how much I talk about it, but Eric Weinstein, who's a friend of mine, who's like, look, I don't know that there's really anything to the aliens thing, but I'm more interested in why is it being pushed so hard? And is it being pushed to distract us? Now, I haven't gone far enough down the rabbit hole to know if I'm right, but this feels like, especially given that story that you just told, that if you're trying to hide something, you'd much rather people be talking about aliens. Now, I don't know that that means that we know what they're trying to hide. I think it would be a foolish conclusion to assume that we do. But it is yet another tick in that column of there really is something going on. And if we are going to be an informed and alert citizenry, I think it is wise to ask sober questions, which as a podcaster, my ilk is not necessarily known for. But asking sober questions of what is going on, that seems pretty important to me. Agree or disagree?
I mean, I personally think it's more interesting to talk about nuclear war than aliens right now in 2024.
Yeah, but I'm not pushing for aliens. What I'm saying is I think we have to answer the question of, and let's make it about nuclear war, we have to ask the question of, why isn't this front and center? Why are you having to write a book about this to remind people of the horrors of this? Is that strategic? Did the government really just take their eye off the ball and stop talking about this? Or do they want to be stockpiling stuff in the background, even if just because of the war machine? Is there a reason for the way they're handling the situation?
The situation meaning nuclear war and the threat of it?
Correct.
I mean, I asked that same question of one of my sources, like when I began to report this book and learn just how much of a precipice we are all living on. To quote UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, that we're one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear Armageddon, nuclear annihilation were his words. I began to wonder, why is this not front and center? And I asked a source exactly that question, like, why isn't the Congress doing something? As we now have 9 nuclear-armed nations, and people are worried about UFOs when they should be thinking about nuclear war. And he said to me, Annie, the Congress only pays attention to what the people are paying attention to, which would be to my point that if the people are sitting around thinking, the government's after me, the government is creating conspiracies, then the people aren't thinking about perhaps things that are more legitimately of concern. So then you have to ask yourself, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Is the government it sounds like that is what you were asking, right? If we're right.
I'm waiting for you to finish. Yeah. That is my follow-up question for sure.
So is the government don't look over here, that would be one way of looking at it. I think one of the important situations for me as a journalist is always to maintain this idea that I try to write books that people can take away their own conclusion. And the best example I give sometimes has to do with a book I wrote called Operation Paperclip. Can I give you the example?
Yeah,
it goes
please.
Like this. Okay, so this was back in Operation Paperclip about the Nazi scientists that came to America after World War II, published in 2014. And back then, a journalist, i.e. me, could go on Fox News and CNN in the same week. Now you can't do that, which is too bad, the polarization of everything. But you could then. So I went on, let's just call them a conservative organization and a very liberal organization. And I went on the very conservative organization, and they said, oh my goodness, Annie Jacobsen, thank you so much for writing Operation Paperclip. You showed us in absolute explicit terms that, these were Nazis, but we had to hire them, because if we didn't, we would all be speaking Russian now. Thank you so much for writing this book. Good job. Then I leave. Then I go on to the liberal news outfit, and they say, Annie Jacobsen, thank you so much for writing this book. You showed us in no uncertain terms. These Nazis should have all been hung at Nuremberg. This is the worst, most despicable, disgraceful thing that the United States government ever did. It's a shame. And you showed us that in no uncertain terms. Thank you so much for writing this book. They read the same book, and they took away radically different conclusions. I do think that is also an important part of a democracy. So I do not fault one side or the other. I am more interested in holding both of those ideas at the same time. And that's something I have learned, by the way, from having a great editor edit my books. And that's what you really want to be, I think. You want to strive to surround yourself with people who have all kinds of different ideas about things that you might not necessarily agree with. And then you can ask yourself, whether you're out walking or driving your car or doing a podcast, you can keep your mind open and flexible to ideas that you hold to be true and ideas that you might be willing to shift a little bit. Make sense?
Very much. Does the government have an interest in directing what we focus on?
Well, again, I think that kind of broad question is a little bit dangerous for me, and I'll tell you why. Like, here's an example. People often say, like, the CIA. I have written about the CIA in all 7 of my books. The CIA has many components. You cannot, I would never say the CIA. I would say, there's like science and technology elements of the CIA that I write about in Area 51. There's paramilitary teams and trigger pullers in the CIA that I write about in Surprise Kill Vanish. There's the former MK Ultra manipulation programs that I wrote about in many of my books. Those are not the same lanes of the CIA. And so the government would be another example. To me, the government isn't the big bad government. It's like, what are you talking? Are you talking about Navy intelligence? Are you talking about the Air Force? I'm not saying you specifically. I just mean in general. So I would have to. I think it's better. I think you can be more critical about your thinking, or more focused about your thinking, and help with the conclusions you draw by being a little bit specific. So to answer your question was, is the government trying to get us to focus on X, not Y?
Sort of. What I'm trying to map how you think about this. Mm-hmm. So what I want to know is, would they have an interest in directing our focus? It's a way less loaded word. Would they have an interest in directing our focus? And then if the government has an interest in directing their focus, does the government apply energy and resources to things that they have an interest in doing? And so what I'm trying to map out is, and what I'm getting from what you're saying, and tell me if I'm headed in the wrong direction, what I'm taking away from what you're saying is, look, all of these things are true. However, if you then apply that as a blanket statement, you're going to step back and go, everything is a grand conspiracy, and you're going to be as blind as somebody who's not paying attention at all.
I think that's well said. But while you were talking, I think I realized there may be a distinction here. Maybe what you're talking about is, when you say the government, I would say you could perhaps substitute that for political parties. And the reason I say that is I completely stay out of politics, very specifically and very ardently. So I don't write about, I've written about all the presidents in all of my books, but I'm writing about POTUS, President of the United States. And sometimes it requires commenting on the individual because of their policies. But I find the most disheartening element of my own country and my own democracy and my own critical thinking right now having to do with the polarization of America, with this crazy idea, and this directly links to nuclear war, this crazy idea that you have to be on one side or the other, and that the other side isn't just your adversary or your opponent, kind of, I see opponent as a sportsman's term, but rather that the other side is the enemy. And then if you are talking about an enemy, then you get into some really, what I find to be odious language about destroying people. And, that becomes, to me, not only unhelpful in living your life, but dangerous. And so if you substitute the questions that you asked me about the government with the two political parties, I might now see a little bit more about what it is you're getting at. And I might tend to agree with you, because if I read something in the news that's politically based, politically driven, my instinct is really like, I'm not going to even read this, because I can just see the bias and the intention to make me think that way coming at me so strong, it becomes uninteresting to me, because it's just opinion based. So I stay away from that kind of thinking.
Okay, so now I'm back to where we started, where you said that governmental secrecy is a powerful force in people's lives. Did you mean, when you said that, political parties, or did you mean the government?
Well, I meant the government when we were talking about that because remember that's my area of expertise. And when I say the government, let me be specific, because I'm not talking about the political part of the government. I'm not really even talking about the executive branch per se. I'm talking about the military and the intelligence community, because that is what I write about. I write about war and weapons and national security and government secrets within the context of the military and the intelligence. So I don't write about the Democratic parties, and then point over there. I'm writing about military and intelligence programs. And because so much of this is science and technology based, and again, let me clarify that I'm writing about the military and the intelligence community from World War II forward. And because technology, and I found this all out almost inadvertently in my reporting, that so much of our world is shaped by military technology that is developed to fight wars. That is probably what I meant more specifically when I said how impactful it is to all of our lives.
Why do people need to understand that?
Well, if they maybe don't, it's not a requirement, but if they want to, they can certainly read my books to learn the origin stories of things.
But I'm guessing, so you spend roughly 2 years per book. Mm-hmm. So I have to imagine that you pick a topic that you think matters, or do you just pick something that you find interesting? So it's just, I find this fascinating. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when you wrote Surprise, Kill, Vanish, mm-hmm. about CIA assassinations, there was no sense of like, hey, it's important that you know that your government does this. It's just, whoa, this is interesting.
It's the latter. Whoa, this is interesting. Oh, yeah, no, I am not. I mean, I am a storyteller at heart. I love a good story. I want to lean into a story. And so when I learned about Bilyeu, I just wanted to know more about him. And I just spent a couple years trying to get him to agree to talk to me. And then once he did, game on. That was that book. And then I build the book around it. But all of my books kind of grow out of a sense of, we talked about this in the green room, fate and circumstance, which you may or may not agree with, but I fundamentally believe that to be true. And then my reporting, I hear a thread of a really interesting, want me to give you a specific example?
Yeah,
I'll
please.
give you the most famous first one, which is Area 51, the book that, I'm pretty much owe my career as a national security reporter to, because it was read by so many people and continues to be read by so many people. And sure, there's the last 12 pages with the, what you spoke of, and everybody goes bananas about that and wants. Well, there's 400 pages before that are really pretty damn interesting. And that is about the CIA's aerial espionage programs that it worked on in the 50s and 60s in utter secrecy out at Area 51. And I learned about that program completely by accident. I was at a Christmas Eve dinner party with a group of people that are sort of family members by marriage that I had attended that similar dinner party for, 5-6 years. When the guy sitting next to me leans over, an 87-year-old man says, "I got a really interesting story." I was reporting on terrorism at the time. He said, "I like your reporting. I got an interesting story." And, you think, okay, everybody has an interesting story. Well, he said, the CIA just declassified 50 years of my life work. And I was like, what? I knew he was an engineer at Lockheed, and I had this preconception that he designed windows or airplane parts. I didn't know. Well, it turned out he was the lead physicist for Lockheed Skunk Works on the U-2 and then the A-12 Oxcart, the precursor plane to the SR-71. And when he said that to me, that was exactly that. I said, wait a minute, where did you do that? It was just kind of a naive person's question. And he said, out in the desert in this place we called, Watertown, this place we called the ranch. Really, where is that? Well, and there was kind of a mystique to what he was saying. And then during the course of that conversation, right then and there, I realized that is Area 51. And I said, my God, you mean Area 51? He said, well, we're not supposed to say that. The word was still classified at the time. So that's a perfect example of, I didn't sit around and think like, I've got to break the story of Area 51. I pity the person who did that because they probably would never get at it. You need to have the inside, I believe, lane from someone who has access to things. And so that's that concept we were talking about before the podcast, ride the horse in the direction it's going. And in that case, when Ed Lovick essentially just like rode up on a horse and like, here's the story. And I got on my horse and followed him. He introduced me to all of his friends, pilots that flew the U-2, engineers that built it. Then they introduced me to Dr. Bud Wheelon, the first director of science and technology at the CIA. Bud Wheelon invented the Corona satellite. So I've been going on, but let me bring this back full circle. What can people learn from my books? They can learn the origin stories of things. They can learn how it began. Because I come into a topic not knowing about it. I didn't know about the U-2 spy plane. I didn't even know what it was. But it seemed like such an interesting story. And so I began the journey of learning it. And that's why I believe I have regular people reading my books like The Truck Driver, because I explain to them in the simplest terms the same way my brain had to learn about it.
It's interesting. I am so curious to know if we take the same thing away from the truck driver. So
what do you take away from it?
That the reason he said, everybody's always told me that I'm dumb, and then after reading your books, I realized that I'm really smart, is that people were telling me that the way that I thought the world worked wasn't accurate. And now reading your books, I realized the way that I believe the world works is actually accurate, which, as somebody who is enthralled by your work, that is exactly what it feels like to me. So it's very possible that I'm just projecting. But yeah. I have become obsessed with understanding how the world works, understanding the points of manipulation. Mm-hmm. I don't want to blind myself, going to my earlier comment, by becoming conspiratorially minded. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, so the one that I'm obsessed with is inflation. So when you think about money printing is quite literally an invisible tax. To use the least offensive language, I think you could call it theft, in that as they print money, they are socializing the losses. And this is why people get so mad at, like, why are you bailing out the rich? Because the way that the the federal bank gets the quote unquote money into the economy is by buying assets. So call it bonds, treasuries. Mm-hmm. And so who's holding those? Investors, the quote unquote rich. So now you have the federal bank in coordination with the federal government putting money into the system by literally taking from everybody, but you're taking from the poor, you're taking from low middle class, the wealthy, everybody equally, but you're only giving it to the people at the top of the food chain that own assets to get that money into the system. So you feel like, but wait a second, I just got money. Well, why would this ever be bad? It's bad because your money loses buying power. Now, they know this, and the government, or certainly the federal bank, they fully understand that this will come due. There is no universe in which you can just print money and it doesn't become a problem. Otherwise, just give everybody $1 trillion. Like, you need only ask that question. Why not give everybody $1 million? And the reason is because you will take what the value of $1 million is and drive it very close to zero. Mm. And so you can't do it. But then why is it cool to give people $5,000? And the answer is you can't do that either. It's just a small enough amount that people don't realize that you've just spread this loss across everybody, including, and this is part of the reason why they love it, China, who owns debt in our country, and we just made that debt worth less. And so when I started going down that rabbit hole, I was like, whoa, I'm being manipulated. My buying power is being stolen from me as I begin to put together a worldview, because people look at me and they think because I got wealthy that, oh, like he must already understand all this stuff. Not at all. I got good at one thing, making money. I understand how to run businesses. That is the thing that I knew how to do. As I started actually, like your truck driver, peeling the layers back and going, whoa, 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 hold on a second. So Bilyeu, who you mentioned earlier, I heard you quote somebody saying about him, he's killed more people than cancer. So I'm like, what? Like, we have that many people running around doing government sanctioned murder.
No. Bilyeu was unique. What's interesting about our discussion here about the truck driver, I think the conclusion is that two people can take away very different points of view about a story. And that is incredibly important and gets to be perfectly great in my book, because we all have different points of view that we're pursuing. I see that truck driver totally different. I just see him as having read my books and go, wow, I can actually read a whole book and totally understand it and then want to read the next one. Because, by the way, a lot of people don't read anymore. I mean, they really don't. You might, most people don't. And so it's also interesting, other paradox there, because he was actually listening to my books. I read all my books, and now I really believe listening to somebody else read a book is reading a book. It's the same thing. So we take away different ideas from that same story, which is part of it. But the Bilyeu of it is, if you read Surprise, Kill, Vanish, I think one of the fascinating things about Bilyeu is he was so unique. He was what was called a singleton, and he operated in a way that I'm not so sure many people operate anymore. I don't know if I'm wrong about that, but that idea has certainly been corroborated by many people in the upper echelons of the agency who I interviewed when I asked them, is Billy special? They were like, hell yeah. Now, your theory could be right, that that's just government disinformation, and there are lots of assassins running around doing the dirty work of the government like Billy did. We won't know until another journalist comes along and peels back the onion, which is a really important part of all of this. I think what we're doing is just having conversations about what we think might be true. I'm really not so sure that you can't hold two ideas at once. I think you can.
Give me the example. What two ideas are you talking about?
Well, you can hold the idea Bilyeu is special, or maybe there are many people just like him. And they don't have to be mutually exclusive. It's not I don't know that I could ever find out that answer.
There's a lot going on right now, boys and girls. Heads up, take in the information, think carefully, react cautiously, be thoughtful. Annie, I have thoroughly enjoyed encountering your work. This, I think, was the first time that I had a chance to read your stuff, and I'm really, really impacted. Like it a lot. Where can people engage with you?
Bookstores everywhere. Bookstores everywhere. And AnnieJacobsen.com.
I love it. Guys, the most recent one is Nuclear War. Whew, it will curl your hair. Give it a read. It's amazing. Speaking of things that are amazing, boys and girls, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace.
If you like this conversation, check out this episode to learn more.
World War III is being fought through these proxy wars, third country battles, oftentimes poor or impoverished battles that are being bankrolled by large world leaders.